It was a crisp Tuesday morning when the world woke up to a headline that seemed impossible. Donald Trump, the former president of the United States, had made an announcement that nobody saw coming. Trump to spend a day living as a homeless person. The words flashed across screens everywhere. Twitter exploded. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, and social media went into a frenzy. Was this a publicity stunt? Was it just another one of his famous eccentric moves? Or was it something more? In a world that had become accustomed to Trump's larger-than-life persona, his gold-plated towers, private jets, and extravagant lifestyle, the idea of him stepping into the shoes of someone who had nothing seemed absurd, even impossible. For most, it was hard to imagine someone like Trump ever experiencing the harsh realities of homelessness. But there it was, in black and white, for everyone to see. Trump sat at his desk in a high-rise penthouse in New York City, a place that overlooked the skyline he'd spent a lifetime building. He stared at the screen as the news ticker ran across the bottom of the television. "Tomorrow, I'll be on the streets," he muttered to himself. It wasn't like him to do anything without planning it meticulously. But for some reason, today was different. Maybe it was the backlash from his recent comments on the state of the country. Maybe it was the endless debates about inequality, about the widening gap between the haves and the have-nots. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because he'd started to feel like he was out of touch. He had always been a man of action, and now, for once, he wanted to experience something real. He wanted to see the world from a different angle. The homeless crisis in America had been on his radar for a long time, but he'd never really understood it firsthand. Sure, he'd driven past the homeless in New York City, waved to a few on the campaign trail, even posed for photos with some of the most prominent advocates for the homeless. But he'd never really lived like them. What will I learn? Trump thought as he stood up from his desk, running his hand over his chin. I'm going to see if I can handle it. I'll prove that I can do it. It'll be a statement. He glanced out the window, at the bustling streets far below. To him, the city was a symbol of power. His power? Everything below him seemed distant, as if it existed in another world. But today, that world would be his. Later that afternoon, Trump stood at a podium, cameras flashing around him, microphones aimed at his face. The room buzzed with anticipation. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit, the familiar click of his shoes echoing through the room as he prepared to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and confident, "I'm about to do something that will shake things up. Tomorrow, I'm going to spend an entire day living on the streets of New York City. I'm going to see what it's like, what people go through, and how it feels to have nothing." The room fell silent for a moment. The journalists exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. Was this a joke? Was he serious? "This isn't some stunt," Trump continued. "This is about understanding. We have a problem in this country, and we need to face it head-on. The homeless crisis is one of the most pressing issues we have. I'm going to live like they do, feel what they feel. I'm going to see it for myself." A murmur of disbelief spread across the room. "Mr. Trump, are you sure this is a good idea?" one reporter asked. "Isn't this just a publicity stunt?" Trump looked out over the crowd, his lips curling into a brief smile. "Call it what you want," he said, "but I'm doing this. And I'll tell you one thing, there's a lot more to it than just walking in their shoes. We need change. We need a plan. And maybe this will be a way to figure that out." The reporters scrambled to ask more questions, but Trump raised his hand and gestured for silence. He was done talking for now. The challenge would begin tomorrow. The world would be watching, and there was no turning back. Back at his penthouse, Trump sat in front of his phone, scrolling through the social media reactions. Tweets, memes, and comments flooded in. Some people were excited. Others were downright mocking him. The hashtags #Trump on the streets and #HomelessTrump were trending. "What a joke," one tweet read. "Like he can understand homelessness in one day. This is just another PR stunt. I'm curious to see how this goes. Is he really going to spend a night on the streets? I doubt it." Others, however, saw an opportunity for something more. Maybe this will actually change his perspective on how to fix homelessness. Let's see what happens. I'm watching this, hoping it opens his eyes. Homelessness is a real problem in America. The opinions were divided. Some felt it was a genuine effort to understand, while others believed it was nothing more than a stunt to distract from his other controversies. But one thing was for sure, people were talking. That evening, Trump met with his team to finalize the logistics of the day ahead. He had arranged for a security team to follow him from a distance, though they would not intervene unless there was a genuine threat. He was determined to do this on his own. "You're really going through with this?" one of his advisors asked, skepticism clear in their voice. Trump leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the table. "I have to. I need to see what's really happening. I need to understand it." His advisor raised an eyebrow. "And what if it's harder than you think?" Trump's expression hardened for a moment. "I'll handle it. I always do." The team continued to discuss the details, but the weight of the decision seemed to hang in the air. Was this just a stunt, or would it actually lead to a deeper understanding of the homeless crisis? Trump was about to find out. As the night wore on, Trump prepared himself mentally for the challenge ahead. Tomorrow, he would step out of his golden bubble and into a world he'd never truly known. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't entirely sure what to expect. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? For most of his life, Donald Trump had been a man of extremes: fame, fortune, controversy, and power. Born into wealth, raised in the glitzy world of New York real estate, Trump was always on the move, building, acquiring, and establishing himself as a symbol of success. From his father's empire in Queens to his own iconic buildings on the Manhattan skyline, everything about Trump had been bigger than life. His name was synonymous with luxury, and for decades, he lived in a gilded world, far removed from the struggles of everyday Americans. But who was the man behind the headlines, the social media posts, and the political campaigns? To truly understand why he would attempt something as radical as spending a day on the streets of New York, we needed to take a look at his past, his psyche, and the forces that shaped him. Donald John Trump was born on June 14, 1946, in Queens, New York, to Fred and Mary Trump. His father, Fred, was a wealthy real estate developer who built a substantial fortune in the boroughs of New York City. From the start, Trump's life was defined by his family's wealth and ambition. He grew up in a privileged household, with access to private schools, expensive vacations, and opportunities that most people could only dream of. But even in a life filled with privilege, there was always a sense of competition. Fred Trump was a demanding father. He expected nothing less than perfection from his children, especially Donald, whom he saw as the most likely to carry on the family legacy. Donald, for his part, felt the pressure from a young age. He was sent off to the New York Military Academy when he was just 13 years old, a decision that would mark the beginning of his complex relationship with authority. It was at this school that Trump developed his tough, no-nonsense persona. He was known for his aggressive nature, his sense of entitlement, and his relentless drive to succeed. Throughout his early years, Trump was determined to show the world that he could not only live up to his father's expectations, but exceed them. While Fred Trump had built an empire in the outer boroughs, Donald set his sights on the heart of New York, Manhattan. In the 1970s, with the help of his father's money and connections, Trump began making his mark in the city's real estate scene. He started with modest projects, acquiring old buildings and transforming them into profitable ventures. But it wasn't long before his ambitions grew, and so did his desire for fame. He was no longer content being just another developer. He wanted to be a public figure, a name that everyone would recognize. By the 1980s, Trump had become a household name. His most famous project, Trump Tower, opened in 1983 and was hailed as a symbol of opulence and success. The 58-story building in Midtown Manhattan was a bold statement, golden, gleaming, and impossibly tall. It was a perfect reflection of Trump's personality, flashy, larger than life, and unapologetically extravagant. His lifestyle matched the image he was cultivating. Trump had multiple residences, including a luxurious penthouse in Trump Tower, a private jet, and, at one point, even a yacht. He surrounded himself with the best and the brightest, constantly seeking out new ways to grow his wealth and influence. Yet, despite all the outward success, there was always a sense that something was missing. Trump's life was never without controversy. His marriages, his business dealings, and his public statements often made headlines for the wrong reasons. He was a polarizing figure, loved by some and hated by others. To his supporters, he was a self-made man who represented the American dream. To his critics, he was a wealthy elitist who had little regard for the struggles of ordinary people. In 2015, after decades of building his real estate empire and cultivating his public persona, Trump took a leap into the political arena. He announced his candidacy for President of the United States, shocking the political establishment and sending shockwaves through the media. His campaign was unconventional, to say the least. He didn't rely on traditional political strategies. Instead, he spoke directly to the frustrations of the American people, using blunt language, provocative statements, and social media to connect with voters. His rise to power was meteoric. Despite the controversies that followed him, his divisive rhetoric, his constant battles with the media, and his unprecedented approach to governance, Trump was elected the 45th President of the United States in 2016. His presidency was marked by polarizing decisions, public feuds, and moments of incredible drama. Yet, despite the turmoil, he remained one of the most prominent and influential figures in American politics. Throughout his career, Trump had always been the one in control. As a businessman, he made the decisions. As a politician, he dictated the conversation. He was accustomed to power, handling crises, managing media, and keeping people at arm's length. But it was during his time in the White House that Trump began to feel a shift. With every policy decision, every scandal, and every public debate, the distance between Trump and the rest of America grew wider. He was no longer just a businessman or even a celebrity. He was the leader of the free world. And yet, the more power he gained, the more isolated he became. The protests, the debates, the constant barrage of media scrutiny, it all started to take its toll. There were moments during his presidency when Trump seemed to step back and question the very world he inhabited. The world of billion-dollar deals, private jets, and gold-plated everything was a far cry from the struggles that everyday Americans faced. But he never truly had the time or inclination to dive into those issues. The political machine, the public image, and the business deals consumed him. As his post-presidency years began, Trump found himself in a new phase of life, one where his every move was dissected by the media, and his legacy was being shaped by critics and supporters alike. It was during this time, after years of living in his own world of wealth and power, that he began to feel something shift inside him. Trump had always been a man of action. He didn't sit idly by, waiting for opportunities to come to him. He created his own path. But now, there was an underlying question nagging at him. What if the real problems of America were not the ones he could fix with business deals and political strategies, but something more human? The announcement to spend a day as a homeless person didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years of hearing about the homelessness crisis, seeing it on the streets of New York, and thinking about it in the context of his own privilege. He had often brushed aside such concerns, focused on bigger issues and his own personal agenda. But deep down, he knew he had to understand it more deeply. This wasn't about policies or politics anymore. It was about real people, real lives, and real suffering. For the first time in a long time, Trump was stepping out of his comfort zone, not as a businessman or a politician, but as a human being trying to experience the world from a different perspective. The morning sun broke over New York City, casting long shadows between the towering skyscrapers. The streets below were alive with the usual frenzy, taxis honking, pedestrians rushing, and the ceaseless hum of city life. But for one man, today was unlike any other. Donald Trump stood at the edge of his penthouse window, staring down at the world below. His reflection in the glass seemed almost distant, as though he were seeing someone else. The man who had spent decades building an empire of gold and glass, was now preparing to step into a world he had only ever observed from the outside. Today, he would live as the homeless did, a person without a roof over his head, without wealth, without the privileges that had defined his entire existence. "Are you ready for this, Mr. Trump?" his assistant asked, breaking him out of his thoughts. Trump turned away from the window, his eyes hardening. "I've been ready for days," he replied, his voice resolute. He wasn't just going through the motions. There was something different in the air today. A challenge, a test he had set for himself, and he wasn't about to back down. In the world of Donald Trump, appearances meant everything. A tailored suit, a crisp tie, and polished shoes were his armor. But today, his armor was different. Gone were the tailored suits, the gold cufflinks, the perfectly combed hair. Today, he was dressed for survival. His team had provided him with a set of simple clothes, an oversized hoodie, worn jeans, and a pair of scuffed sneakers. The clothes felt strange against his skin. They were uncomfortable, baggy, and lacked the formality he was so accustomed to. But this wasn't about comfort. It was about immersion. Trump knew that the best way to understand what it meant to live on the streets was to throw away the trappings of wealth and status, to shed the armor that had defined him for so long. As he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the hood of his sweatshirt, he couldn't help but feel a sense of vulnerability. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure what to expect. He had always been in control, always been the one giving orders. Today, he would be the one following them, following the rhythm of a world where he had no say. The moment Trump stepped out of his luxury apartment and into the streets of Manhattan, the contrast was jarring. The cold air hit him immediately, biting at his skin in a way that no high-end coat or designer jacket could shield. He was no longer the powerful former president or the billionaire real estate mogul. He was just another face in the crowd, just another person walking among the faceless masses of New York City. Trump had always been accustomed to being noticed, to being the center of attention. But today, it was as if he had vanished into the background. People walked past him without a second glance, their eyes focused on their own destinations, their own lives. For the first time, he felt invisible. He looked around, taking in the sights and sounds of the city from a new perspective. There was a homeless man huddled under a worn blanket by the entrance to a subway station. A woman, looking disheveled and exhausted, sat on the curb with a cardboard sign that read, "Anything helps." A group of teenagers, dressed in designer clothes, walked by, oblivious to the woman's plight. Trump's eyes lingered on the woman for a moment longer than he intended. He could feel his stomach tighten. This was real. This was the world of the people he had often seen from the safety of his limousine or behind the glass walls of his penthouse. But today, he wasn't on the other side. Today, he was in it. As he walked down Fifth Avenue, Trump's nerves began to show. The streets, so familiar from his many years in the city, now felt alien. He wasn't sure where to go, who to talk to, or even how to navigate this unfamiliar world. His first interaction came when he saw a man sitting on the sidewalk, leaning against a building, with a cup in front of him. The man was holding a small piece of cardboard that read, "Homeless, please help." Trump, for a moment, hesitated. This wasn't a business transaction, and he wasn't here to make deals. He was here to understand. "Hey," Trump said, his voice uncharacteristically unsure. The man looked up, his eyes squinting in the morning sun. He was in his late 50s, with a weathered face and ragged clothes. His hair was matted, and his beard was unkempt. "You got $1?" the man asked, his voice raspy. Trump fumbled for his wallet, but as he reached into his pocket, he realized he didn't have anything. His pockets were empty. He had left his cash, credit cards, and all forms of identification back in the penthouse. He had only the clothes on his back and the raw, uneasy feeling that he was now part of a world he had never truly known. I don't have any cash," Trump said, looking down at the man. The man gave him a skeptical look. "Then what are you doing here, buddy?" he asked, his tone tinged with bitterness. "You think this is some kind of joke?" Trump felt a pang of guilt, and for the first time, it wasn't something he could simply brush off. "No," he said quietly, "I'm just trying to understand, trying to see what it's like." The man studied him for a moment, his eyes scanning Trump's attire. "You won't get it in a day," he muttered, then turned his attention back to his cup. "But good luck, I guess." Trump stood there for a moment, processing the exchange. He had expected more, perhaps a deeper conversation, or even some kind of sympathy. Instead, he was met with skepticism, even disdain. The man had no interest in explaining his life to someone who looked, for all intents and purposes, like a tourist in this world. Trump wandered the streets for the next several hours, trying to make sense of his surroundings. The cold started to seep into his bones, and the weight of the day began to press down on him. He tried to find a place to sit, somewhere to rest, but there were few safe havens for people in his position. Every bench was occupied, every corner filled with someone else trying to avoid the harshness of the city. He walked past a group of people huddled together in a doorway, sharing a bottle of water. They looked at him with suspicion, but no one said anything. He wasn't one of them, and they weren't about to let him in. He tried to find a place to eat, but the streets seemed to offer little in the way of food. There were food trucks, but the lines were long, and he had no money to pay for anything. He watched as people walked by, carrying bags of takeout or sipping on coffee from the nearest Starbucks. It wasn't until he saw a corner store with a small, handwritten sign that read, "Free meals for the homeless," that he felt a glimmer of hope. Inside, the air was warmer, and there were a few other people sitting at tables, eating small portions of soup and bread. Trump sat down at an empty table, silently accepting a bowl of soup that had been placed in front of him. It wasn't much, but it was something. As he ate, he noticed the quiet camaraderie between the people around him. They didn't speak much, but there was a silent understanding. They were in this together. Trump finished his meal in silence, his mind racing. He had only been on the streets for a few hours, and already, he was beginning to feel a fraction of what it was like to live without certainty, without stability. For all his wealth, for all his success, he had never experienced this. The randomness, the harshness, the constant struggle to find food, shelter, or just a moment of peace. It was humbling, but it was also just the beginning. The sun had begun to dip below the skyline, casting an orange glow across the city. It was an unsettling sight. The gleaming lights of Manhattan, the symbol of wealth and power, contrasted sharply with the dim, cold reality of the streets. For most, nightfall meant the end of another day. But for Donald Trump, it marked the beginning of a new challenge, one that would test his endurance, his resourcefulness, and his understanding of a world he had never truly known. He sat on the worn bench in the corner store, the warmth from the soup still lingering in his stomach, but the chill of the night creeping into his bones. His shoes, once polished to perfection, now felt heavy and uncomfortable. The scuffed sneakers he'd been given for the experiment were inadequate for walking the cold, unforgiving pavement. They were uncomfortable, and after hours of walking, his feet ached. He rubbed his legs and shifted uncomfortably, trying to find a way to ease the pain. But this was nothing compared to what so many people endured on a daily basis. Trump felt the weight of the moment, the growing realization that survival on the streets was about more than just food and shelter. It was about holding onto your dignity in a world that constantly tried to strip it away. As the hours wore on, Trump began to realize just how difficult it was to find a safe place to sleep. The night had grown colder, the streets busier, and the chaos of the day seemed to settle into a different rhythm. The noise of the city had softened, but the tension in the air remained palpable. He walked through Times Square, hoping to find somewhere quiet to rest his head for a few hours, but the crowds were still thick. People rushed by, oblivious to the man who now walked among them, a man whose face was known across the globe, but who now blended into the sea of strangers. Trump looked up at the towering buildings, wondering where he would sleep tonight. He passed by a homeless woman sitting with a makeshift blanket around her, her eyes following him for a moment before she looked away. He approached a nearby alleyway, his footsteps echoing in the narrow space between buildings. A few homeless individuals huddled against the walls, but there was no room for him here. He couldn't ask to share a spot. It felt wrong, somehow, as if it would be an imposition. As he continued walking, he found himself drawn to a group of people huddled together under a bridge. They had made their own little community, gathering around a fire pit that crackled in the night. Trump hesitated for a moment before walking over. The people looked up at him with mixed expressions, curiosity, wariness, and, for some, a touch of disdain. "Hey there," Trump said, his voice quieter than usual. One of the men, a tall African-American with a thick beard, gave him a long look. "What do you want?" I'm just looking for a place to sleep for the night," Trump replied, trying to sound casual, but his discomfort was clear. "I'm not trying to cause trouble. The man raised an eyebrow, sizing Trump up. This is our space, man. You don't get to just roll up in here. We've got a system. Trump nodded, feeling the sting of rejection. He hadn't expected it to be easy, but the reality of being an outsider, someone without status, without the ability to pay for space or comfort, was hitting him hard. He had always lived in places where his name alone could get him what he wanted. But here, on the streets, that name meant nothing. Sorry, man, the tall man said after a long pause. No room tonight. Trump turned away, walking deeper into the night, realizing that the idea of home meant something entirely different now. Home wasn't about luxury or space or comfort. It was about survival. About finding a place where you felt safe, even if just for a few hours. At this point, the novelty of the experience had begun to wear off, and Trump found himself questioning why he had decided to undertake this challenge. The physical exhaustion was taking a toll, but it was the emotional weight that was starting to sink in. He wasn't used to feeling vulnerable. His entire life had been built on the assumption that power and wealth could shield him from harm, could protect him from the harsher realities of life. But here, in the heart of New York, he was just another person fighting to survive. He reached another intersection, staring at the blurred lights from the street signs and neon billboards. He noticed a small group of teenagers huddled together on the corner. They were laughing and joking, oblivious to the man standing a few feet away. They were part of a different world, one where they had everything Trump lacked in that moment. Comfort, stability, the assurance that they wouldn't have to spend their nights fighting for survival. He approached them cautiously, not sure what to say or if they'd even acknowledge him. One of the boys, noticing Trump's disheveled appearance, tilted his head. Yo, are you okay? Trump took a breath, trying to steady himself. I'm just trying to figure things out, he said. You lost or something? One of the girls asked, eyeing him skeptically. She was young, no older than 18, but her expression carried the cynicism of someone who had seen too much of the world already. Trump hesitated. He wasn't sure how much to reveal. Just out here for a little while. You know, trying to understand what it's like. The girl and the boys exchanged glances. They had heard it all before. People from all walks of life coming into the streets for some reality check. But something about the sincerity in Trump's voice made them pause. You're lucky you're not actually one of us, the boy with the skateboard said. We don't do check-ins here. If you're out here, it's because you're stuck. Trump felt a pang of something. Maybe guilt, maybe frustration. But he didn't know how to explain what he was feeling. He wasn't stuck. He could end this experiment anytime. But the people around him couldn't. They didn't have the luxury of walking away. By midnight, Trump found himself back in the park, the one place he'd seen people sleep earlier in the day. He sat down on a cold bench under a street lamp, his back aching, his hands shaking from the cold. He had been here for hours, walking through the streets, talking to people, and trying to make sense of the new world he was in. But now, in the darkness, it hit him fully. The world of homelessness wasn't something he could understand in just one day. It wasn't about empathy or charity. It was a brutal, unrelenting cycle that wore people down bit by bit. For the first time in his life, Donald Trump wasn't in control. There were no deals to be made, no media interviews to give, no presidential speeches to deliver. He was just another person trying to make it through the night. The city he had once dominated, a place where he had always been in command, was now a labyrinth of obstacles and uncertainties. He was no longer an icon or a mogul. He was simply someone struggling to survive, struggling to get through a night in a world that had no place for him. He pulled his hood tighter over his head and closed his eyes, bracing himself for what was to come. It was a long night ahead, and the lessons were far from over. The city had long since quieted down, but for Donald Trump, the night had only just begun. He sat hunched on the cold, uncomfortable park bench, his back stiff, his limbs heavy. The sounds of the city, once so familiar and reassuring, had now become distant, almost muffled by the weight of his thoughts. The lights from the surrounding buildings flickered overhead, but here, in the darkened park, it felt like the world had slipped away entirely. The cold air bit at his skin, and his breath came out in visible puffs. He had never truly understood what it meant to be cold. Sure, he'd had winters in his penthouse and resorts around the world, But none of it had ever felt like this. The freezing wind cut through his thin hoodie, and the cold metal of the bench beneath him seemed to seep into his bones. He had no idea where to go next, no idea how he was supposed to spend the next few hours. He stood up from the bench, his legs stiff and sore, and began to pace. He had tried to sleep, but the discomfort was unbearable. The sense of vulnerability was overwhelming. He was no longer the man in charge, the one who made the rules. Out here, he was at the mercy of forces beyond his control, and it was a terrifying realization. As he walked, he passed by another group of homeless individuals huddled together, wrapped in blankets, their heads down as they slept on the hard pavement. Trump's chest tightened as he took in their peaceful, yet tragic, repose. They had found their own way to survive, but he couldn't help but wonder how long they could keep it up. As the hours wore on, Trump began to realize just how much he had taken for granted. The simple act of finding a place to sleep had become an impossible task. He couldn't just find a spot and rest. He had to constantly be on the move, avoiding the cold, staying out of sight, and searching for any place that felt even remotely safe. He had no idea how these people did it, how they could survive day after day, week after week, in a constant state of uncertainty. He had been homeless for less than a day, and already, he felt like he was at his breaking point. How did they endure it for months, even years? In the distance, he spotted a shelter sign, something that he had ignored earlier in the day. Trump's heart sank as he approached it. It was a place for those who had nowhere else to go, a temporary refuge from the streets. He hesitated, unsure of whether he wanted to go inside. Was he ready to accept help from a shelter, a place where he would be just another nameless face in a crowd? Could he swallow his pride and walk through those doors? He stood at the entrance, staring at the small group of people gathered outside. Some were talking quietly, others staring into the distance with vacant expressions. A sense of desperation clung to the air, but there was something else too, a sense of familiarity. These people weren't just survivors of circumstance. They were survivors in every sense of the word. They had learned to live with the unrelenting weight of the streets, to find comfort where there was none. One of the men outside the shelter approached Trump, looking him over with a knowing gaze. "You here for a bed?" the man asked, his voice low and rough. Trump nodded. "Yeah, I think so." The man gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You got to sign in. They'll get you a spot for the night." Trump followed the man inside, his heart pounding. The shelter was dimly lit, with rows of beds lined up along the walls, each one occupied by someone trying to rest. The air was thick with the smell of damp clothes and body odor, and the sounds of muffled conversations echoed through the room. The people here, like the ones he had seen outside, were just trying to get through the night, one moment at a time. He found an empty spot on a cot near the back of the room and sat down. His body was exhausted, but his mind was racing. He had come here seeking refuge, but he knew this wasn't the end of his journey. This was just one stop on the long road of understanding, a road that was filled with questions he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. Trump lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling. He had been through many difficult situations in his life. Business deals gone wrong, scandals that threatened to ruin him, and public battles that had tested his resolve. But this was different. This wasn't a problem that could be solved with money or influence. This was a fight for dignity, for survival, and there were no easy answers. He closed his eyes and tried to sleep, but sleep didn't come. Instead, his thoughts churned with questions. What had led these people to the streets? Was it just bad luck? Bad decisions? Was it the system that failed them, or had they failed themselves? Trump's mind flashed back to the people he had encountered earlier in the day. The homeless man by the subway entrance, the woman with the cardboard sign, the teenagers who had given him a hard time. He had tried to understand, but the complexity of it all was overwhelming. What he realized then, in the stillness of the shelter, was that homelessness wasn't just about having a roof over your head. It was about losing your sense of self, your place in the world. It was about losing everything: your job, your family, your community, and finding yourself alone, adrift in a world that seemed indifferent to your suffering. Trump's mind drifted back to his own life, to the wealth, the fame, the power. He had never known the feeling of being truly invisible, of walking through a world where no one cared who you were or what you had accomplished. He had never been in a situation where his name meant nothing, where his influence counted for nothing. And yet, here he was, in a room full of people who had experienced that same emptiness for far longer than he could even imagine. The following morning, Trump woke up to the sound of the shelter's morning routine. The overhead lights flickered on, and a staff member began walking through the rows of cots, gently nudging people awake. The air felt colder now, the warmth of the night having long since faded. Trump rubbed his eyes and sat up slowly, feeling the stiffness in his body. He was sore, tired, and hungry, but most of all, he felt disoriented. He had expected this experiment to be difficult, but he hadn't expected it to be so draining, both physically and emotionally. The night had felt like a never-ending battle, and as he rose from the cot, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss. He was just one more face in the crowd now, a man with no power, no status, and no safety net. When he stepped outside, the city was already awake. People rushed by him, oblivious to the struggle he had just experienced. The street vendors were setting up, the taxis were honking, and the world was moving as it always had. But Trump knew, deep down, that things had shifted. This wasn't just a game anymore. It was real. He had spent a night as one of the invisible. Now, he was back in the world he knew, but he was different. The experience had left its mark, and he wasn't sure if it was something he could ever fully shake off. The next day, Trump wandered through the streets of Manhattan, reflecting on his night at the shelter. The experiences from the previous 24 hours continued to churn in his mind, leaving him with a feeling of unease. As he navigated the crowded sidewalks, he couldn't escape the sense of detachment he felt from the world around him. People rushed past, too busy with their own lives to notice the man who had, only a few hours ago, walked the streets in the same way as countless others without homes. He had hoped for clarity in his experiment, but the more he experienced, the more questions arose. How could people live like this? Where did they go for comfort, for refuge, when the world seemed to have forgotten them? For a man like Trump, accustomed to the luxuries of private jets, lavish dinners, and exclusive deals, the world of the homeless felt like an alien planet. But it wasn't just the physical discomfort. It was the psychological toll that was beginning to weigh on him. Trump's gaze shifted to a man sitting by a park bench, his clothes ragged and his face etched with the hardship of many years. The man had a small bag beside him, which contained all of his belongings. He stared out into the street, his expression distant, almost empty. Trump felt a pang of something, sympathy, maybe, but also a sense of guilt. It was an uncomfortable realization. While he had lived a life of excess, this man had lived a life of survival, a life where every moment was about finding enough food, finding a safe space, and staying alive. Trump walked slowly toward the bench where the man sat. His boots clicked against the pavement, the noise harsh against the stillness of the park. The man didn't look up at first, but Trump hesitated, unsure of how to begin. "Hey, are you okay?" Trump asked, his voice softer than usual. The man's eyes flickered up at him, and for a moment, Trump could see the hesitation in his gaze. This wasn't the kind of interaction people typically had with the homeless. Most just ignored them, as though they weren't even there. But the man didn't look away. "I'm fine," the man replied gruffly, his voice raspy. "Just trying to make it through the day." Trump didn't know what to say. He felt awkward, out of place, but he pushed past it. "What's your name?" "James," the man answered, his tone guarded but not unkind. "And you are?" Trump hesitated for a second. "Donald. Donald Trump." James' eyes widened, and for a split second, Trump saw a flicker of recognition. It was strange, being recognized but also feeling like he wasn't in his world anymore. "Donald Trump?" James repeated, squinting at him. "What are you doing here?" Trump had to think fast. "Just trying to understand what it's like. What life is really like out here." He almost didn't believe it as he said it. He was a businessman, not a man trying to understand life on the streets. But for some reason, the words felt right. James raised an eyebrow. "You really want to know? You want to understand what it's like living on these streets?" Trump nodded. He wasn't sure why, but he felt compelled to listen. Yes, I do. James sighed, shifting slightly on the bench. He looked out into the busy street before turning back to Trump. Well, it's not all about survival. Sure, we survive, but that's not the hard part. The hard part is the loneliness, the feeling that nobody sees you, that you're invisible. You walk down these streets, and people walk right past you. They don't even look at you. They don't care. You know what it's like? To be in a room full of people, and yet, feel like you're completely alone? Trump was taken aback by James' words. He had never considered the emotional side of homelessness, the isolation, the shame that often came with it. In all his years, Trump had never truly felt invisible. Even in the most difficult of times, he was always seen. People always knew who he was. Yeah, I think I understand, Trump said quietly, unsure of how else to respond. The discomfort of the conversation was palpable, but he knew there was a truth in it, one that he had never encountered in his wealth-filled world. James gave a short laugh, shaking his head. I'm sure you think you do. But let me tell you something, man. You can survive without food for a while, without shelter even. But you can't survive the way we live if you don't have any hope left. Trump sat there in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of the words. He felt a surge of empathy, but there was also a sense of helplessness. Hope? How did you hold on to that when the world was so relentlessly harsh? As Trump and James talked, a group of people walked past. Some were heading to work, others simply passing through the park. None of them gave James a second glance. Trump watched as a well-dressed woman walked by, her gaze flicking quickly over the scene but never landing on James. She saw him, but in that fleeting moment, she chose to look away, to pretend he wasn't there. See what I mean? James muttered, watching her go. They don't see us. We're just a part of the background noise. Trump followed the woman with his eyes, but he couldn't shake the uncomfortable truth that was starting to sink in. He had been one of those people, the ones who walked by, oblivious to the struggles of others. He had never taken the time to truly look. He had never thought about the lives behind the homeless faces he saw on the streets, the stories that lay hidden beneath their clothes and their circumstances. I didn't know, Trump said, almost to himself. I didn't realize how deep it went. James shrugged. No one does, until they have to live it. The conversation shifted then, as James began telling Trump his own story. He spoke of a time when he had a job, a family, and a life he was proud of. He had worked hard for everything he had, but one setback after another, a health crisis, financial ruin, a lost job, had led him to the streets. He wasn't looking for sympathy. He just wanted someone to hear him. By the time Trump left James in the park, the weight of the conversation had taken root. He walked through the streets, trying to make sense of everything. It was one thing to read about homelessness, to see it from a distance, but it was another thing entirely to sit down with someone who had lived it, someone who had experienced the daily grind of survival on the streets. Trump's perspective was changing, but it wasn't clear yet how much of a change it would be. He had started this journey to understand homelessness, to experience what it was really like. But he was starting to realize that this wasn't just about experiencing a few hardships. It was about seeing the world through a different lens. It was about recognizing that the real challenge wasn't just surviving. It was surviving with dignity, with hope, in a world that often seemed intent on stripping it all away. It was hard for Trump to shake off the weight of his conversation with James. The hours following that meeting seemed to stretch endlessly as he wandered through the streets of Manhattan, lost in thought. For the first time in a long while, he found himself questioning not only the world around him but also his place in it. He had grown up with privilege, surrounded by luxury, and the demands of his public life had always come with a certainty that he had the power to change almost anything. But now, as he walked these streets, he realized just how powerless he truly was in this new world, the world of the homeless. The skyline loomed above him, grand and imposing, but it felt distant, alien, as if it belonged to a different universe altogether. He had spent years climbing to the top, fighting tooth and nail to secure his success. But on the streets, success didn't matter. Money didn't matter. Power didn't matter. As he passed familiar landmarks, the towering office buildings, the fancy restaurants, the expensive stores. Trump began to feel a sense of isolation that was almost suffocating. People were walking past him, heads held high, confident in their positions in life, but he felt more like a ghost than a man. He was no longer the man who walked these streets with pride, a figure of wealth and authority. Here, he was just another face in the crowd, and it stung. The cold wind that blew down from the East River was harsh and unyielding, biting through Trump's jacket and numbing his skin. He pulled his sleeves down to cover his hands as he walked, but it didn't help. His mind was no longer focused on the physical discomfort, it was on the reality of the situation. How did so many people fall through the cracks of society? How was it possible that a nation as powerful as the United States could let so many of its citizens endure this kind of suffering? Trump had always prided himself on his ability to solve problems. But the problem of homelessness felt so insurmountable. The more he learned, the more he realized that this wasn't a problem that could be solved with a simple solution. It wasn't about giving people jobs or homes. Those things were part of the equation, but they didn't address the deeper issues. The systemic failures, the social stigma, the lack of mental health support, the limited resources, the broken systems that kept people trapped. He had met people like James, who had been homeless for years. He had heard their stories, the lost jobs, the broken families, the invisible struggles that had pushed them to the streets. But even more than the personal stories, it was the stories of the system's failure that haunted him. James wasn't just a victim of bad luck or bad decisions. He was a victim of a system that had failed to support him when he needed it most. The more Trump thought about it, the more it became clear to him. Homelessness wasn't just a personal problem, it was a societal issue. And in a country that prided itself on its prosperity and opportunity, how could such a thing exist on such a large scale? Trump decided to visit a local outreach center the next day. The center, which provided meals, medical care, and job training for homeless individuals, was a far cry from the lavish organizations he was used to dealing with. As he walked through the door, he was immediately greeted by a friendly social worker named Sarah. She was in her late 20s, with an approachable smile and a calm demeanor. "Hi, can I help you?" she asked, noticing Trump's disheveled appearance. Despite her professional tone, she seemed used to people coming in with all kinds of backgrounds, and Trump didn't stand out, except maybe for the sheer contrast between his usual self and the situation he now found himself in. "Yes," Trump replied, offering a tight smile. "I'm Donald Trump. I wanted to learn more about what you do here." Sarah didn't react at first. Her expression remained neutral, though there was a hint of recognition in her eyes. She didn't seem overly impressed, and that was a small relief to Trump. He didn't want his name to overshadow the reality of what he was trying to understand. "Well, we provide food, medical services, and job training for those experiencing homelessness," Sarah began, leading Trump down a narrow hallway. "We also work on connecting people with housing and support programs. But the truth is, it's not just about getting people off the streets. A lot of the time, the real challenge is helping them get back on their feet emotionally and mentally." Trump nodded. He had heard the term mental health a few times in passing, but it had never really clicked with him. "What do you mean by that?" he asked. Sarah paused. "Well, many people who are homeless are dealing with trauma. Some have been through abuse, addiction, or have lost everything in a way that breaks their spirit. That's why we try to offer more than just a meal. We want to help people rebuild their self-worth. Without that, the cycle of homelessness just continues. It's not enough to give someone a place to sleep. You need to help them find hope, dignity, and the belief that they can rebuild their life." Trump's stomach tightened as he processed her words. He had assumed that homelessness was simply a matter of getting a person a job or a roof over their head, but Sarah's explanation shifted his understanding entirely. People needed more than that. They needed the emotional and mental support to survive and to heal. As Sarah continued to explain the programs the Outreach Center offered, Trump found himself grappling with an unsettling realization. The issue of homelessness was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about poverty. It was about the breakdown of families, the lack of mental health care, the absence of a safety net for those who fell through the cracks. People didn't just need shelter and food. They needed support systems, they needed hope, and they needed to know that there was a way out. When Sarah finally finished her tour of the center, she looked at Trump. "So, what do you think?" she asked. Trump stood there, his mind racing. He had gone into this whole experiment thinking that he would understand homelessness simply by walking the streets, by experiencing a few days in the shoes of those less fortunate. But now, he realized that his journey had barely scratched the surface. "This isn't just about surviving," Trump said slowly. "It's about rebuilding a life, giving people the tools to move forward, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally." Sarah nodded. "Exactly." Trump walked out of the center feeling a sense of humility he hadn't felt in a long time. He had come here to learn, but what he had learned wasn't what he expected. The answers weren't as simple as he had hoped. The issue of homelessness was too vast, too deep, and too tangled to be solved in a few easy steps. But now he knew that he couldn't turn away from it. He couldn't unsee the faces of the people he had met, the stories they had shared. For the first time, Trump wondered if he might have a role to play in fixing the system he had always taken for granted. But what that role was, he wasn't sure yet. Trump didn't sleep well that night. His mind kept turning over the conversations, the faces he had encountered, and the overwhelming weight of the systemic issues surrounding homelessness. He had expected the streets to teach him something, but the lessons had come faster and harder than he anticipated. In the quiet of his temporary room, he replayed his interactions over and over, especially his conversation with Sarah at the outreach center. There was something about her words that stuck with him. It's not just about surviving. It's about rebuilding. The next morning, he was up early. Despite the lack of sleep, there was an unusual energy in his chest. He had come to the city to understand homelessness, and now he was beginning to realize that understanding meant more than just observing. He had been given a glimpse into the deeper realities of the issue, but it was clear that the journey ahead would require more than just empathy. It would demand action. He couldn't ignore the question that had been haunting him. How could someone in his position, with his resources and influence, help change this reality? There had to be more he could do than just write a check or show up for photo ops. This was a complex issue, and it was becoming clear that it would take more than just the typical business-minded solutions he was used to. Trump's mind raced with ideas as he walked through the streets of Manhattan. He knew that change had to begin somewhere, and he couldn't continue to live in ignorance of the struggles so many people faced. After a few days of reflection, he decided to meet with his team. It was time to begin creating a plan. Not just a plan for personal redemption or publicity, but a genuine effort to make a difference. The meeting was set up in a boardroom at Trump Tower. His staff, including his closest advisors, filled the seats around the large table. They were used to discussions about real estate deals, brand strategy, and political maneuvers. But today, the topic would be different. "I've spent the last week experiencing something most of you have probably never had to think about," Trump began, looking around at his team. "Homelessness. I've met some of the people who live on our streets, and I've seen firsthand how deep the problems run. This is not just about giving people food and shelter. It's about giving them a chance to rebuild their lives, a chance to find hope, a chance to be seen." The room was quiet, his team waiting for him to continue. "I'm not just talking about donating money to shelters. I'm talking about systemic change. I want to start something that's going to address not just the surface-level problems but the root causes. Mental health services, job training, affordable housing, education. Real support for people who are trying to get out of this cycle." His team exchanged looks. It wasn't a surprise that Trump was interested in finding solutions, but this approach was different from anything they had dealt with before. This wasn't a brand-building exercise. This was about something much bigger than that. One of his advisors, Mark, broke the silence. "Mr. Trump, you're talking about a complete overhaul of how we address homelessness. It's a massive undertaking. Are you sure you want to get into this? There are a lot of organizations already working in this space, and it's not an easy fix." Trump leaned forward, his face serious. "I know it won't be easy, but that's the point. Easy doesn't fix anything. I want to get in there, not just throw money at the problem. I want to make a real difference." Another advisor, Sarah, added, "This could change everything for you, Donald. It's not just about solving homelessness. If you succeed, you could change how society views this issue altogether. But it won't be quick. You'll need partnerships with local governments, nonprofits, and other key organizations." Trump nodded. Exactly. But we've done impossible things before. We can do this, too. We just need the right people and the right focus. Over the next few weeks, Trump worked tirelessly with his team to begin laying the groundwork for a new initiative. He reached out to nonprofits and local government officials, seeking advice and partnerships. He met with mental health professionals to understand how the system for helping those with mental health challenges could be improved. He spent time talking with social workers, local leaders, and activists to better understand what was truly needed. It became clear to him that homelessness wasn't a one-size-fits-all problem. Some people needed housing. Others needed jobs. Some needed mental health care or addiction treatment. And many needed all of the above. But they all needed something more: dignity, respect, and the opportunity to regain their place in society. Trump's team worked day and night, meeting with people in the field, gathering data, and crafting a proposal for a new approach to homelessness. The plan was ambitious, and many of his advisors questioned whether it was realistic. But Trump wasn't deterred. He had made his fortune by taking risks, and he wasn't about to back down from this challenge. As the project began to take shape, Trump started receiving backlash from certain quarters. Critics questioned his sincerity. Was this just another publicity stunt? Was he really serious about addressing homelessness, or was he just trying to play the hero? It wasn't easy for Trump to deal with the criticism. He was used to being a polarizing figure, but this was different. This wasn't about his brand or his image. This was about people's lives, and he wasn't going to let anyone undermine that. One evening, as Trump sat in his office reviewing the latest drafts of the proposal, he received a call from James, the man he had met in the park. James had been one of the first people Trump had reached out to for feedback on his plans. "Hey, Donald," James said, his voice warm but cautious. "I heard about what you're trying to do. I just wanted to say thanks. I don't know if it'll work, but just the fact that someone like you is trying to change things, that means something." Trump paused, his mind racing. "I'm not doing it for recognition, James. I just want to see things get better. I want to see people like you get a fair shot." James' voice cracked slightly. "Well, you got a lot of people hoping you can make a difference. I'm one of them. Just don't give up, okay?" Trump's hand tightened on the phone. The pressure, the criticism, the uncertainty. It was all starting to add up. But hearing James' words brought something deep inside him to the surface. This wasn't just about making a difference in the world. It was about making sure that people who had been forgotten could find a way back. It was about providing hope, not just for survival, but for a future. "Don't worry," Trump said, a rare softness in his voice. "I'm in this for the long haul." As the weeks went by, Trump's commitment to his newfound mission grew stronger. His team worked tirelessly to refine the plans for a comprehensive initiative that would address homelessness on a multifaceted level: mental health, addiction recovery, job training, affordable housing, and more. But despite the effort, doubts lingered. There were still questions about whether the plan could succeed and how it would be received by the public. Trump knew that actions spoke louder than words. To prove he was serious, he needed to get involved in the practical side of the plan. He wasn't just going to sit in a boardroom and sign checks. He had to get his hands dirty, show up, and lead by example. Trump had spent the last few days meeting with experts and gathering feedback. But now, it was time to return to the streets, the very place where his journey had begun. His team arranged for a trip to one of the most notorious homeless encampments in the city. The area was a stark contrast to the luxury he was used to. Dirty streets, makeshift tents, and people who looked as if they had given up hope were all around him. Despite all the preparations and strategic meetings, walking through this area felt like a punch in the gut. Trump had seen poverty before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about economics. It was about lives broken and discarded. It was about people who had been failed by every system they had relied on, left to fend for themselves with little to no help. As he walked through the encampment, the faces of the people there seemed to watch him, sizing him up. They were used to people walking by, ignoring them or offering empty promises. But Trump wasn't walking by. He was there to understand, to listen, and, most importantly, to find a way forward. He stopped and talked to a few of the people in the encampment. One man, whose name was Greg, explained how he had once had a steady job and a family. But a series of personal misfortunes, including a divorce and a severe injury that prevented him from working, led him to the streets. "I didn't ask for this," Greg said, his voice tinged with bitterness and resignation. "But here I am, just trying to survive. Nobody seems to care." Trump nodded, feeling a deep sense of empathy. "I'm sorry this happened to you, but we're going to change that. We're going to make sure that people like you don't get forgotten." It wasn't the first time Trump had promised change. He had built his reputation on delivering results, but this time, the stakes were much higher. It wasn't about making money or gaining power. It was about the lives of the people he was speaking to. That evening, Trump found himself alone in a small diner, reflecting on what he had seen and heard. The faces of the people in the encampment haunted him, and for the first time, he questioned the way society had allowed things to get this bad. He had been wealthy and powerful for so long that it was easy to forget about the people at the very bottom. But now that he had seen their lives up close, he couldn't unsee it. His thoughts were interrupted by a call from his daughter, Ivanka, who had been following his progress with the homelessness initiative. "Dad, how's it going?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Trump leaned back in his booth, his thoughts still swirling. "It's tougher than I thought, Ivanka. The problem is bigger than just housing or jobs. These people have been left behind in so many ways. It's not just about providing for them. It's about giving them back their dignity, their sense of worth." Ivanka paused. "I'm proud of you for taking this on, Dad. But remember, it's going to take time. This isn't a quick fix. It's about showing up, consistently. People need to see that you're in this for the long haul." Trump sighed, running his hand through his hair. "You're right. It's just, I've always been able to fix things quickly. But this is different." "You've always been a fighter," Ivanka said warmly. "And you've already taken the first step. That's what matters. Keep going." Trump appreciated his daughter's words. But even as he hung up the phone, he knew the hardest part was still ahead. He had learned a lot from the people on the streets, but now he had to prove that the change he was promising wasn't just empty rhetoric. He needed to deliver real results. The next day, Trump held a series of meetings with local government officials, nonprofit leaders, and business experts. He was determined to get his plan off the ground, but the more he discussed his ideas, the more complicated things became. The scale of what he wanted to do was massive, and coordinating all the various pieces, mental health services, job training, housing programs, and more, was a logistical nightmare. One of the key challenges Trump faced was the lack of coordination among the different organizations and government agencies working to address homelessness. It seemed as though everyone had their own approach, and nobody was working together. "How do we get these different groups to collaborate?" Trump asked, looking around the table. "We can't afford to have everyone working in silos. We need to unite these efforts into one cohesive plan." A local government official spoke up. "That's easier said than done. There's a lot of red tape involved. Agencies are often underfunded, and political disagreements can complicate things further." Trump's mind raced. He had spent years navigating bureaucratic systems, cutting through red tape, and making things happen. This, however, was different. The stakes were higher, and the players involved were not easily swayed. "I don't care about politics," Trump said, his voice firm. "I care about results. We need to cut through the bureaucracy and make real change happen. I'm willing to invest whatever it takes, but we need to start now." The room fell silent for a moment as everyone processed his words. Trump had always been known for his boldness, but this was a different kind of boldness. He wasn't just looking to expand his empire. He was trying to change the very systems that had allowed homelessness to thrive. By the end of the meeting, Trump had secured a commitment from several key organizations to join forces in a new, collaborative initiative to address homelessness in the city. It was a significant victory, but it was only the beginning. As Trump left the meeting, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. He had started a journey that would take years to complete, and the road ahead would be filled with challenges, setbacks, and tough decisions. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose, a purpose that went beyond his own legacy or wealth. This was about the people who had been left behind, and it was up to him to make sure that they weren't forgotten anymore. Trump's new initiative was off to a strong start. He had made key connections with powerful figures, both in the public and private sectors, and had garnered media attention. But despite all the momentum, something was starting to feel off. The first few weeks of his push for change were marked by the thrill of progress, but that was quickly tempered by the resistance he was beginning to face. The first sign of trouble came in the form of public backlash. Trump had been used to criticism, but this was different. His critics weren't just questioning his sincerity. They were attacking the very foundation of his plan. The media had begun to report on the details of his proposal, and not all the coverage was positive. Some outlets dismissed it as a publicity stunt, accusing Trump of trying to rebuild his image at the expense of vulnerable people. Others doubted whether his vast business acumen could translate into solving such a complex societal issue. In the comment sections, the responses ranged from supportive to outright hostile. A segment on one of the major news channels put it bluntly, "Can Donald Trump really fix homelessness? Is this just another one of his ventures to make himself look like a hero?" For the first time in months, Trump felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He was used to critics, but he had expected more support for such an important cause. The doubts from both the public and the media were starting to eat away at his confidence. But it wasn't just external resistance that was threatening his efforts. As the months passed, Trump began to feel pressure from within his own organization. Some of his advisors, including Mark and Sarah, who had been instrumental in developing the initiative, were growing concerned about the direction the project was taking. "Donald, I think you're going too fast," Mark said one day during a meeting. "You've got a great plan, but you need to build the right infrastructure first. You can't expect everything to fall into place overnight." Trump clenched his jaw. He had heard these kinds of cautions before in the world of real estate, people telling him that his ideas were too ambitious, too risky. He had always brushed those concerns aside. But this time, it felt different. The stakes were higher, and he couldn't afford to fail. "I'm not here to play it safe," Trump said, his voice low but firm. "I want results, and I want them now. These people can't wait. They need change, not empty promises." Sarah, always the voice of reason, added, "We're not saying you shouldn't act quickly, but we have to be strategic. You can't just throw money and resources at this and hope it works. It's going to take time. A lot of time." Trump paused, feeling the weight of her words. He had always been known for his impatience, for pushing hard and fast to get what he wanted. But he was beginning to realize that this issue wasn't like any of his past ventures. He was treading in unknown territory, and the path wasn't as clear as it had been when he was building towers and launching brands. Meanwhile, the people who had been relying on his initiative for hope were starting to feel uncertain as well. At one of the outreach centers Trump had funded, Sarah had met with a group of homeless people who had been following the progress of his initiative. They had high hopes that change was coming, but doubts were starting to creep in. "I heard about your plan, Sarah," one man, George, said. "I want to believe it's going to help. But it's been weeks now, and all I see are meetings and press releases. We need real action, not just talk." Sarah felt the weight of his words. She had always believed in Trump's vision, but even she was beginning to wonder if he could deliver on his promises. The cracks in the foundation of his plan were beginning to show. Back at Trump Tower, he sat alone in his office, staring out the window at the skyline. The weight of the resistance, both from the outside and from within his team, was starting to settle in. He had expected challenges. He was no stranger to obstacles. But this felt different. This wasn't a business deal. This was about people's lives, and there were no easy fixes. He thought about the people he had met, the faces that haunted him. People like Greg, the man he had met in the encampment who had lost everything. People like Sarah, who worked tirelessly to help others despite her own struggles. People who had lived through hardships that Trump could never fully understand. He thought about his own family and the support they had given him. Ivanka's words ringing in his ears. "Don't give up, Dad." Trump knew he couldn't give up, but he also knew he couldn't just bulldoze his way through this. He needed to listen. He needed to slow down, assess the situation, and reevaluate his approach. He needed to build a foundation, not just for the people on the streets, but for the initiative itself. The next day, Trump called a meeting with his core team. He knew he needed to address the concerns head-on. It was time to recalibrate. "We need to rethink our approach," Trump began, his voice more measured than usual. "I've been pushing too hard, and I've been too focused on speed. This isn't a race. It's about laying a solid foundation that lasts. We need to be strategic. We need to focus on quality, not just quantity. Mark nodded. That's a good call. We have to create a sustainable model. Rushing into things isn't going to help anyone. We need to start small, test what works, and then scale up. Sarah added. And we need to listen to the people we're trying to help. They know what works best for them. We need to put more resources into community engagement, hear their stories, and integrate their feedback into our plans. Trump's mind raced as he processed their suggestions. He had always been a man of action, but now he understood that action without careful thought could lead to failure. He was learning a lesson that was more valuable than any business deal he had ever made. Change required patience, careful planning, and collaboration. All right, Trump said, taking a deep breath. We're going to reassess our strategies, make sure we're on the right track, and ensure that we're actually solving the problem, not just trying to look good. I want to hear from the people who are out there, in the trenches. We need to get this right. Trump's decision to recalibrate his approach to homelessness had been a tough but necessary one. The feedback from his team had made him realize that his previous strategy of speed and spectacle might not be the answer. He was now focused on a more methodical, sustainable plan. But the true test was how the public would respond to this new, slower pace. Would they still believe in his vision? The shift in approach didn't go unnoticed. The media, which had previously been skeptical, began to report on Trump's new direction. Some outlets praised him for showing a willingness to change course, while others criticized him for dragging his feet. One evening, a live televised debate was scheduled. The debate was going to feature experts on homelessness, as well as politicians from both sides of the aisle, and Trump himself. It was clear this would be a pivotal moment for his initiative. The public would see not only his plans but his ability to handle the pressure of tough questions. As Trump stood backstage, preparing for the debate, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. The outcome of this debate could shape the future of his homelessness initiative, and perhaps his legacy. He glanced at his team. We're not just talking about policy here. We're talking about real lives. People are watching. Sarah, who had been by his side since the beginning, nodded. You've got this. Just remember, don't get defensive. Focus on the real change we're working towards. Trump took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The debate began with a series of pointed questions from the moderator, aimed at each of the participants. When Trump's turn came, he wasted no time in outlining his new plan, focusing on the importance of affordable housing, mental health services, addiction recovery, and job training. He spoke passionately, his confidence returning. We're not here to make empty promises. I've seen firsthand what this crisis looks like. People are living in tents on the streets. They're struggling, and we owe them better. This isn't just a policy issue. This is a human issue. And it's one I'm committed to solving. He emphasized that his new strategy would involve working closely with local communities to provide solutions that were tailored to the unique needs of each area. He promised that his initiative wouldn't be a one-size-fits-all approach, but would allow for flexibility and real collaboration. We need to stop treating homelessness as a side issue, Trump continued. It's a crisis that affects millions of Americans, and we can no longer afford to turn a blind eye. But as soon as he finished, the tough questions began to fly. One of the first critics to speak up was Senator Maria Lopez, a staunch advocate for affordable housing who had been vocal about Trump's previous approach. Mr. Trump, she said with a raised eyebrow, your plan sounds great in theory, but the reality is far more complex. Homelessness isn't just about housing. It's about the systemic issues that have failed these individuals. Mental health, addiction, job discrimination. Can your plan truly address all of that? Trump responded quickly, we're not just putting people in houses. We're addressing the root causes. We're bringing in mental health professionals, addiction counselors, and job trainers. This is a holistic approach. Lopez was unconvinced. But what about the funding, Mr. Trump? You've promised billions for this initiative. Where is that money coming from? The government is already stretched thin. What makes you think this is a feasible plan? The question stung. Trump knew the financial side of the plan would be one of the most difficult challenges. His initial enthusiasm had not fully accounted for the complexity of securing long-term funding for such an ambitious undertaking. But he had to stand firm. We're going to make this work, he said confidently, though his voice lacked the conviction he wanted. "I'll be leveraging both public and private investments. It's about getting the right people involved, and it's about prioritizing this issue over others that have been neglected for far too long." Despite Trump's response, the criticism didn't stop. Another panelist, Dr. Alice Montgomery, a social worker who specialized in homelessness, challenged Trump's approach. "It's easy to talk about solving homelessness, but it's much harder to actually do it. Your plan seems like it's all about optics, press conferences, media coverage, but where's the real substance?" The public's reaction was swift. Social media exploded with both praise and criticism. Some supported Trump's commitment to the cause, while others felt he was still out of touch with the true needs of the homeless community. The hashtag Trump Homeless Plan began trending, with both supporters and detractors weighing in. By the time the debate ended, Trump knew one thing for sure: this wasn't going to be easy. He had underestimated the magnitude of the challenge. This was no longer just about him. It was about thousands of people whose lives depended on whether or not his plan could succeed. Back in his hotel room that night, Trump stood in front of the mirror, staring at his reflection. The bright lights of the stage still felt fresh in his mind. The tough questions, the hostile audience, the nagging doubts, everything was swirling. For the first time since he began this journey, Trump questioned whether he was truly up to the task. Could he really make a lasting difference? Would his plan actually succeed, or would it crumble under the weight of its own ambition? He thought about the people he had met on the streets, the faces of Greg, George, and others who had shared their stories. He couldn't let them down. He couldn't walk away now. But it was clear that this was going to be harder than he had ever imagined. As he sat down to review his notes for the next step of his plan, his phone rang. It was Ivanka. "Dad, I saw the debate," she said. "You did great, but I could tell it was tough." Trump let out a sigh. "It's more complicated than I thought. People are skeptical. The funding's a mess. And I'm not sure if my plan is enough to truly solve this." Ivanka's voice softened. "Dad, you've been through tough fights before. This is just another challenge. The right thing rarely comes easy. But if anyone can do it, it's you." Her words sparked a flicker of determination in him. He wasn't done yet. This wasn't over. The public debate had left Trump with much to think about. The criticisms were sharp, and for the first time in a long time, the doubt had settled in his mind. But as the days went by, he began to gather himself. He couldn't afford to let this opportunity slip away, not when so many lives were at stake. The initiative wasn't just his plan. It was a potential lifeline for thousands of homeless individuals across the country. He couldn't give up, not now. Trump knew that he had to show the world he was serious. It wasn't enough to just talk about grand ideas or throw around promises. People needed to see action. But what kind of action? That was the question he had been wrestling with since the debate. He needed to refine his plan, make it more tangible, more immediate. He couldn't afford more delays, more abstract promises. He called a meeting with Mark and Sarah. They had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, but he could sense their growing frustration with the lack of concrete progress. It was time to shake things up. "We need a pilot project," Trump said, his voice steady. "Something small but impactful. We can't just talk about it. We need to show people that we're moving forward. I want to start in a city, in one neighborhood, and demonstrate how our approach works. We'll get the results, and then we'll scale it." Mark raised an eyebrow. "A pilot project? You mean like a test run?" Trump nodded. "Exactly. We take a small group, show them we're serious about providing housing, job training, addiction recovery, and mental health support. And then we take that success and expand it. We'll create a model people can follow. A real, functional solution." Sarah leaned forward. "It's going to be a lot of work, but it could work. If we get it right, it'll show the world that this isn't just talk, it's action." Trump smiled. Finally, he had a clear direction. The next few weeks would be critical. If they could make the pilot project work, it could be the spark that ignited the larger initiative. After considering several cities, Trump and his team decided to launch the pilot project in Detroit, a city that had long struggled with homelessness but was also eager for change. The choice wasn't random. Detroit had a unique set of challenges, but it also had a passionate community of activists, business owners, and local government officials who were ready to collaborate on a solution. Trump was determined to make sure that this project would involve not just top-down leadership, but a bottom-up approach as well. He wanted to involve local leaders, community organizations, and most importantly, the people who had been homeless in the planning process. He needed to make sure the solution was realistic and tailored to the needs of the community. We're going to go in, listen to the people, and do whatever it takes to change the situation, Trump said, rallying his team. We're not just going to fix homelessness. We're going to fix Detroit. As the weeks passed, the pilot project began to take shape. Trump, Mark, and Sarah spent countless hours working with local officials, social workers, and homelessness experts. They worked closely with shelters, food banks, and addiction recovery centers to ensure that the needs of the people would be met holistically. Trump made sure that every penny of the funding would go directly to the people who needed it most. The team focused on creating affordable housing for a small group of individuals who had been living on the streets for years. The homes weren't luxurious, but they were safe, stable, and, most importantly, they provided a sense of security and dignity. Each participant in the project would also receive job training, counseling, and mental health support, resources that had been sorely lacking in many other programs. Trump visited Detroit several times during the early stages of the project. He wanted to see for himself what was happening on the ground, to hear the stories of the people who were now part of the program. He had met with some of them before, but this time was different. This time, he was seeing the real impact of the changes he was helping to implement. One morning, he visited a newly opened shelter where several individuals were receiving job training. The shelter was full of people, each one with a story, a past, and a new chance at a better life. One man, David, a former construction worker who had lost his job during the economic downturn, was now receiving training in carpentry. He had been living on the streets for nearly 5 years before being selected for the pilot project. "I can't believe I'm here," David said, wiping a tear from his eye. "I didn't think I would ever have a chance to start over. But now, I'm learning a trade, and I've got a roof over my head. I finally feel like I have a future." Trump, who had always been known for his bravado, couldn't help but feel a lump form in his throat. This was the real power of the project, not just the housing or the jobs, but the hope it gave people like David. He turned to Mark, who was standing beside him. "This is what it's all about," he said quietly. "We're not just putting people in houses. We're giving them back their dignity." Despite the progress, not everything was going smoothly. As with any large project, there were setbacks. Some of the participants in the program were struggling to adjust to the structure of the support system. A few had relapsed into addiction, and others were having trouble finding stable employment. These challenges were tough to swallow, especially for Trump, who had put so much of his reputation on the line for the success of this initiative. One evening, as he reviewed the data with his team, Trump's frustration boiled over. "We're not moving fast enough. This is supposed to be a model for the whole country. How are we going to scale it if it's not working on the ground?" Mark and Sarah exchanged a glance. They knew the reality was more complicated than Trump had envisioned, but they also knew that setbacks were a natural part of the process. "Donald, this is a long-term problem. We're making progress, but it's going to take time," Sarah said gently. "We've got people who are showing real progress, and that's something. But this isn't going to be a quick fix." Trump took a deep breath. He knew she was right. He couldn't rush the process, not if he truly wanted to make a difference. As the months passed, more and more individuals began to show signs of recovery. David secured a full-time job in a local construction company. Others found work in retail, while some enrolled in vocational training programs that would set them on a new career path. The city of Detroit was starting to show signs of change. Trump's phone buzzed one afternoon with a news alert. The headline read, "Trump's homelessness pilot project in Detroit shows early signs of success." The article was a mix of cautious optimism and skepticism, but for Trump, it was a victory. Trump's pilot project in Detroit had gained attention across the nation, but the challenges were far from over. While the initiative had helped many individuals regain their stability, critics were still vocal about the project's scalability. Was it truly a sustainable model, or was it just a temporary fix for a deeper, systemic issue? Trump knew that to truly change the narrative, he had to take the next step, expand the project. But how? Trump had made countless visits to Detroit since the launch of the pilot. He had met with the participants, listened to their stories, and seen firsthand the positive changes that were beginning to take shape. People like David had started to rebuild their lives, but others still faced overwhelming obstacles. The question remained, how could he ensure that the progress in Detroit wasn't just an isolated success, but a template for other cities? The team convened in Trump's office one morning, the walls lined with maps of major U.S. cities. Mark, Sarah, and a few homelessness experts had gathered to discuss the next steps. Trump was already making plans for the expansion, but he needed to know the best way to scale. We've seen success in Detroit, but the needs in other cities could be vastly different, Mark said, eyeing the maps on the table. We'll need to customize our approach. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Trump nodded. I get that, but we can't afford to wait. We have to push forward. What I want is a plan to replicate the success we've had in Detroit, but with the flexibility to meet the unique challenges in each city. Sarah chimed in. We need more buy-in from local governments, businesses, and community leaders. The model we've created in Detroit has worked because everyone is on board. If we're going to scale this up, we need more partnerships. Trump leaned back in his chair. He'd always been a master at building alliances, and this was no different. He knew he had to leverage his influence to bring in key stakeholders. But he also knew it wasn't just about the partnerships. It was about proving to the public that his plan could work on a larger scale. As Trump pondered his next move, the media buzz around the project intensified. Some outlets continued to question the sustainability of the initiative, but many others began to focus on the tangible progress that had been made. Stories of former homeless individuals turning their lives around were being featured on major news channels, and social media was filled with hashtags like #TrumpHomelessProject and #DetroitSuccess. Trump had always understood the power of publicity, and while he had been criticized for using the media to his advantage in the past, he knew that this time, it was necessary to get the word out about his project. But it wasn't just about the headlines. It was about creating a nationwide conversation about homelessness. We've got to go bigger, Trump said one evening to his team. I want to see a documentary about this project, not just about the pilot, but about the people whose lives were changing. Let's show America what this is really about. Let them see the human side of the story. The team quickly set to work on the documentary. They began filming interviews with participants in Detroit, capturing their stories of struggle, hope, and recovery. The crew followed people like David as they navigated the ups and downs of life after homelessness, showcasing their challenges and their triumphs. Once the documentary was in the works, Trump shifted his focus to expanding the project to other cities. The next target was Los Angeles, a city with one of the highest rates of homelessness in the country. Trump's team had already been in talks with local officials, and the response had been positive. Los Angeles was ready for change. Los Angeles presented a unique set of challenges. Unlike Detroit, which had a relatively centralized homeless population, LA had a sprawling network of encampments scattered throughout the city. The team knew that addressing the needs of homeless people in LA would require a more decentralized approach. Trump had to make sure that the city's vast resources could be mobilized effectively to create a comprehensive support system. One of the first steps was setting up temporary shelters, but unlike traditional shelters, these would offer more than just a bed. They would provide immediate access to services like mental health counseling, addiction treatment, and job training. The goal was to give people the tools they needed to move from homelessness to stability as quickly as possible. Trump visited LA to kick off the project. The city was in the midst of a crisis, with encampments taking over parks and sidewalks. But the local government was on board, and Trump was eager to make his mark. He stood before a crowd of reporters at a press conference, promising that this initiative would be the blueprint for future efforts across the country. We've already seen success in Detroit, Trump said, his voice strong and confident. Now, we're bringing that same success to Los Angeles. We're going to give people the tools they need to get back on their feet. This is about more than just giving them a home. It's about giving them hope. Despite the optimism, scaling the project to LA was no easy task. The sheer size of the city posed logistical challenges that Detroit hadn't had to deal with. Trump's team quickly realized that they would need to partner with local businesses and organizations to make the project work on a large scale. One of the first obstacles they encountered was funding. Los Angeles was expensive, and the cost of providing services to the homeless population was higher than in Detroit. Trump had to navigate city bureaucracy and negotiate with private donors and investors to secure the necessary funds. He knew the pressure was on. If this project failed, it would be a major setback for the entire initiative. But despite the challenges, Trump pressed forward. He rallied local business owners, philanthropists, and community leaders, urging them to invest in the future of their city. Slowly but surely, partnerships began to form and resources were allocated. As the months passed, the LA project began to show signs of success. More people were moving into housing, receiving job training, and finding work. The temporary shelters were becoming stepping stones to permanent solutions, and there was a growing sense of optimism in areas that had previously been plagued by encampments. One of the most significant success stories was a woman named Maria, who had been living in a tent near downtown LA for over a year. Maria had struggled with addiction and had been in and out of rehab centers. But with the help of the program, she was able to find a stable living situation and enroll in a job training program that would eventually lead to a full-time position as a medical assistant. "I never thought this day would come," Maria said, her voice filled with emotion. "I thought I was stuck, but this program gave me the tools I needed to get my life back on track. I'm working again. I have a place to live. I can finally see a future." Trump knew that stories like Maria's were the heart of his initiative. They were the reason he was pushing forward, despite the setbacks and challenges. But he also knew that LA was just the beginning. He had a long road ahead if he was going to make this a nationwide solution. As the pilot projects in Detroit and Los Angeles began to take root, Trump's initiative to combat homelessness gained nationwide attention. Media outlets continued to report on the progress, while skeptics remained cautious about the long-term viability of the plan. The question on everyone's mind was simple. Could this approach be replicated across the country? And more importantly, could it sustain itself in the face of ongoing challenges? But for Trump, these questions were nothing more than noise. He had always believed in taking bold action, and the success in Detroit and LA was proof that his approach could work. It was time to take the next step, to move beyond individual cities and scale his project to a national level. Trump understood the power of momentum. The media had been largely favorable toward the project, especially given the personal stories of recovery and renewal that were emerging from the pilot cities. But now, it was about creating a sense of urgency. He needed to rally the American people to get behind the initiative and push it from a local success into a nationwide movement. He began giving speeches across the country, appearing in key cities to speak directly to the public. His message was simple. Homelessness wasn't just a local issue. It was a national crisis, and it required a national solution. "We've seen what's possible when we work together," Trump said in a speech in Chicago, standing before a crowd of eager listeners. "The project in Detroit is proving that we can turn the tide, and Los Angeles is showing us how we can scale it. But we need the entire country to get behind this. This isn't about politics. This is about the future of our people. It's time to take action." He traveled from city to city, engaging with local leaders, business owners, and concerned citizens, urging them to join the effort. Slowly but surely, he began to see more and more people coming on board. Government officials, philanthropists, corporate executives, all willing to lend their time, money, and resources to the cause. The groundwork for a national movement was being laid. Trump's next challenge was to refine the blueprint of the pilot program and adapt it for cities of all sizes. He knew that not every city would have the same resources as Detroit or Los Angeles, but the basic framework of housing, job training, and mental health services could be customized to fit the needs of different communities. In every city, Trump's team began by building partnerships with local governments and organizations. They identified neighborhoods with high concentrations of homelessness and started the process of setting up shelters that would also offer services like addiction recovery programs, job readiness training, and mental health support. These services weren't just about providing a temporary fix. They were meant to give people the tools they needed to rebuild their lives. "Homelessness is not just about housing," Trump often said. "It's about restoring hope, dignity, and the chance to live a full life again." The national expansion wasn't just a matter of logistical challenges. It was also about shifting public perception. For years, homelessness had been treated as a moral failing or a problem that was too difficult to solve. But Trump's initiative was different. By focusing on the humanity of those affected, he was able to start changing the conversation. Of course, not everyone was on board with Trump's plan. While many were inspired by the initiative's success, there were still powerful forces that questioned its feasibility. Some critics argued that Trump's approach was overly ambitious, while others pointed to the rising cost of implementing such a large-scale program. There were even protests in some cities, with activists questioning whether the money allocated for homelessness might be better spent on other issues, like education or healthcare. And while Trump had garnered support from many key players, including private donors and local officials, he still faced opposition from those who doubted that a top-down approach could truly make a difference in such a complex issue. In Washington, a group of senators began to challenge the proposed national budget for homelessness, questioning whether it would drain resources from other social programs. This opposition began to take shape as a major political issue, threatening to slow down the progress Trump had worked so hard to create. But Trump wasn't the type to back down. He understood that no major movement could succeed without facing resistance. So, he fought back, making sure that the conversation stayed focused on the human impact of the initiative. He rallied his supporters, using his well-established media presence to amplify the voices of those whose lives were changing for the better. "I've seen the results with my own eyes," Trump said in a radio interview. "I've met people who thought they'd never have a chance, and now they're working, they're building families, and they're getting back on their feet. We're doing what others said was impossible. We're saving lives." Despite the resistance, the movement began to gain significant traction. Cities across the country began to launch their own versions of the homelessness project, following Trump's blueprint but tailoring it to their own needs. Some cities focused heavily on mental health services, while others worked to address the growing problem of addiction among the homeless population. Even in smaller towns and rural areas, the ripple effect of Trump's initiative was being felt. Local shelters began to provide more comprehensive services, and businesses began to partner with nonprofits to offer job training and employment opportunities to homeless individuals. One of the most striking aspects of the national expansion was the way it inspired grassroots movements. In city after city, ordinary citizens began to volunteer their time, energy, and resources to help their local communities. The idea of homelessness as a nationwide crisis began to shift toward the idea that homelessness was something that could be tackled locally, with every community taking responsibility for its own. Months into the national rollout, Trump found himself standing before a crowd in New York City, delivering one of the most important speeches of his career. The skyscrapers behind him cast long shadows, but the mood in the crowd was one of optimism. Across the city and across the country, change was happening. "This isn't just about me," Trump said, his voice resonating through the streets. "This is about all of us. We have the power to change the world. We've already started, and together, we'll finish it." Homelessness is not a permanent condition. It's an obstacle, and with the right resources, the right plan, and the right determination, we can overcome it. The crowd erupted in applause. It was a moment of unity and collective purpose. But Trump knew that the road ahead was still long. There were many more challenges to face, and not all of them would be easy to overcome. But for the first time in years, he felt like the country was truly behind him. This wasn't just a political project, it was a national movement, and it was gaining momentum with every passing day. As the national expansion of the homelessness initiative continued, Trump began to realize that the project's true test wasn't going to come from the critics, the budget battles, or the media backlash. It was going to come from the people who had experienced homelessness firsthand. They were the ones who would either validate the project's success or expose its flaws. It was time for him to take a closer look at what was truly happening on the ground, and that meant going deeper than the headlines and sound bites. Trump had visited a number of cities by this point, but San Francisco, home to one of the largest homeless populations in the country, was a critical piece of the puzzle. The city had long struggled with homelessness, and while the project had shown signs of success in other places, San Francisco was going to be the ultimate test. If it could succeed there, Trump believed the movement would have a fighting chance to go national. Trump arrived in San Francisco with his team, visiting some of the city's most affected neighborhoods. He walked through streets where tents lined the sidewalks, with people huddled together for warmth. The contrast between the wealth of Silicon Valley, just a few miles away, and the dire conditions in the city streets was stark. He spent the day talking to the homeless population, hearing their stories of hardship, but also their hopes for a future. One man, a former tech worker named Ryan, shared how he had lost everything: his job, his family, his apartment, after a series of bad decisions and an addiction to prescription pills. Another woman, Jessica, talked about how she had escaped an abusive relationship but couldn't find a way out of homelessness. "I just need a chance," Ryan said, his voice tinged with desperation. "I used to have it all. Now I'm just another face in the crowd." Jessica echoed his sentiment. "I know I can do more, but I need help to get back on my feet. I don't know where to start anymore." Trump listened attentively. These were the stories that reminded him why he had embarked on this journey in the first place. The stakes were personal. He wasn't just trying to address a problem. He was trying to give people like Ryan and Jessica a new shot at life. But the challenges in San Francisco were bigger than anything he had dealt with before. As Trump's team worked with local officials to implement the homelessness program in San Francisco, the city's unique challenges became clear. The sheer volume of people living on the streets, coupled with the complexity of addiction, mental health issues, and the lack of affordable housing, made it difficult to establish the kind of rapid recovery scene in Detroit and Los Angeles. One key issue was the lack of space. San Francisco's expensive real estate market made it nearly impossible to find affordable land for shelters or transitional housing. Even if the city could acquire space, the costs of developing it into livable housing were astronomical. Trump's team quickly realized that it wouldn't be enough to just provide shelter. They needed to find a way to make the entire process sustainable. "We can't just keep throwing money at the problem," Mark, one of Trump's advisors, said during a strategy meeting. "We have to get creative. We need long-term solutions, not just temporary fixes." But the creativity Trump needed came with its own set of hurdles. Many residents of the city were opposed to new shelters being built in their neighborhoods. The not-in-my-backyard mentality was strong in San Francisco, and local protests erupted whenever plans to build new shelters were announced. Trump knew that overcoming this opposition would be difficult, but he also knew that it was necessary for the project to move forward. The debate over homelessness had become increasingly ideological. While Trump's project aimed to offer a solution that combined private sector innovation and government support, many of his critics insisted that the problem was more systemic. They argued that homelessness was a direct result of income inequality, the lack of affordable health care, and a housing crisis that was spiraling out of control. They believed that true change could only come through sweeping reforms at the national level. One afternoon, Trump sat down for a televised debate with one of his harshest critics, Senator Linda Hayes, a progressive Democrat from California. Hayes had been outspoken in her opposition to Trump's project, arguing that it didn't address the root causes of homelessness. "The problem isn't just that people are living on the streets," Hayes said during the debate. "The problem is that we have a broken system that leaves too many people behind. Until we address healthcare, housing, and the growing wealth gap, initiatives like Trump's will be nothing more than Band-Aid solutions." Trump didn't back down. "Senator Hayes, I agree that we need to address systemic issues, but we can't wait for the perfect solution. People are dying on the streets today, and we need to act now. What I'm doing is giving people a chance, a way out, a path forward. This isn't about politics, it's about saving lives." The debate was heated, and it only fueled the larger national conversation about homelessness. Trump knew that he was walking a fine line. On one side, he was facing opposition from those who believed in more radical reforms, and on the other, he had to prove to the public that his approach could make a real difference. As Trump's program began to roll out across the country, the pressure mounted. Every success was met with new obstacles. Every victory revealed the complexity of the issue. But despite the challenges, Trump refused to give up. His determination was unwavering. He knew that this was his moment to make a lasting impact. In San Francisco, things started to take a turn. While the larger structural changes were still far off, the pilot projects within the city began to show results. Several people who had been living on the streets for years moved into housing, started work training programs, and found jobs. One woman, Maria, who had been living in an alley near Fisherman's Wharf, found a place in a temporary shelter and was able to secure a job as a caregiver. "I never thought I'd get out of here," Maria said with tears in her eyes. "But now I'm working again. I'm building a life. I can finally sleep at night without worrying about where I'll be tomorrow. The stories like Maria's were the ones that made it all worth it for Trump. The success in San Francisco, while far from perfect, was a significant step forward. But Trump knew that for the project to truly succeed on a national level, the system would need to evolve continuously. And he was more than ready for the challenge. As the success stories from San Francisco began to trickle in, Trump knew that the work was far from over. The media hailed his initiative as a possible turning point in the fight against homelessness, but the skepticism in some corners of the political landscape persisted. He faced mounting pressure to prove that his approach wasn't just another temporary fix, but a sustainable solution to a problem that had plagued the nation for decades. For Trump, the battle wasn't just about securing funding or overcoming political resistance. It was about convincing the public that real change was possible. He knew that homelessness wasn't a one-size-fits-all issue. It was complex, rooted in deep economic and social factors. But he had a vision, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. The next big step in Trump's journey was to convene a summit of experts, advocates, and leaders from across the country to discuss how to improve and scale the homelessness initiative. He invited city officials from places like New York, Los Angeles, and Miami, along with social workers, healthcare professionals, and leaders of nonprofit organizations. Trump also made sure to include voices from those who had experienced homelessness themselves, people who had seen the system from the inside out. The summit took place in Washington, D.C., and the energy in the room was palpable. Everyone was eager to hear how Trump's program could be adapted to work for cities of all sizes, and how they could continue to improve upon what had already been accomplished. Homelessness is a problem we can't ignore any longer, Trump said as he opened the summit. For too long, we've treated it as a temporary issue. But it's time to take a new approach. We need bold solutions, solutions that bring all of us together. Trump's goal for the summit was clear. He wanted to hear from everyone, experts and everyday people alike, on how to make the program more effective. For the first time in years, he allowed the conversation to be more open, giving room for new ideas and suggestions. One of the most inspiring discussions came from a young social worker named Emily, who had spent the past decade working in rural areas of the Midwest, where homelessness often went unnoticed. Emily spoke passionately about the need for community-driven solutions, particularly in smaller towns where resources were limited. We can't always rely on big government or big corporations to fix the problem, Emily said. In small towns, the solution is often in our own hands. We need to empower local communities to take charge and create their own programs that fit their specific needs. Trump nodded thoughtfully. He knew that this was an important point. While his vision for a nationwide approach was crucial, Emily's argument emphasized the importance of local ownership in solving homelessness. Another key insight came from a former homeless man named Darnell, who had turned his life around with the help of the program in Detroit. It's not just about a place to sleep or a meal. It's about dignity. It's about having a chance to rebuild your life, Darnell said. We need to make sure the people we're helping feel valued. They need to know that someone believes in them. The summit marked a turning point in the initiative. It was no longer just a program dictated by Washington. It was a movement, one that involved local communities, businesses, and individuals all coming together to create lasting change. Trump's team began working closely with grassroots organizations, and new collaborations emerged between local governments and the private sector. One notable partnership was with a large tech company, which offered to provide job training and placement programs for homeless individuals, especially in cities like San Francisco and Seattle where the tech industry had seen significant growth. These companies recognized the opportunity to invest in their communities and help lift people out of poverty. In the months following the summit, Trump's initiative began to take on a new life. The stories of people like Maria and Darnell continued to inspire others. Local shelters and recovery programs started working more closely with schools, hospitals, and businesses to provide a full spectrum of support for those transitioning out of homelessness. Despite the increasing momentum and the expanding network of support, the critics began to mobilize again. The same voices that had warned Trump that his approach was unsustainable came back with new arguments. Some pointed to the rising costs of the program, claiming that it was draining public funds without offering long-term solutions. Others argued that Trump's model didn't go far enough to address the root causes of homelessness, such as mental illness, addiction, and a lack of affordable housing. Senator Hayes, still one of Trump's most vocal opponents, released a statement calling for a more comprehensive approach that included more funding for affordable housing and healthcare. This is a moment for us to be bold, to make the kind of systemic changes that are needed to solve homelessness once and for all, Hayes said. We can't just keep putting a Band-Aid on a wound. We need to fix the system. Trump's team knew that the criticism was inevitable, but they remained committed to proving that the initiative was making a tangible difference. They continued to push forward, using data and stories from the field to demonstrate that the program was working, one person at a time. As the debate raged on, Trump found himself reflecting on the bigger picture. Yes, the program was expensive, and yes, it required significant investments in time and resources. But what really mattered were the lives being changed. In Detroit, in San Francisco, in New York, and in dozens of other cities across the country, real people were getting the chance to rebuild their lives. They were finding jobs, healing from addictions, reuniting with their families. They were starting over. It wasn't perfect. There were still thousands of people living on the streets. But the momentum was undeniable. Every success, no matter how small, was another step forward. Trump spent one evening in a shelter in Los Angeles, speaking with a group of people who had recently transitioned out of homelessness. One man, James, looked at Trump with a smile. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," James said. "You gave me a chance when I didn't have one. I'm working again. I've got my life back." That moment, Trump thought, was the real measure of success. As the homelessness initiative expanded, Trump knew that the true measure of success wouldn't come from the headlines or even the praise from his supporters. The true test would be whether the program could sustain itself in the face of growing challenges. He had made bold promises, but now it was time to prove that the program could evolve into something lasting, not just a temporary solution. The tipping point came when the program reached a critical juncture, when the real impacts, both positive and negative, began to be felt more widely. In cities like Los Angeles and Chicago, where homelessness had been particularly severe, things started to improve. The shelter systems were getting better, more people were finding stable housing, and more job opportunities were opening up. But at the same time, the program was beginning to expose the deeper, systemic issues in the country's approach to social welfare. The increased demand for services was a good sign. It meant the initiative was reaching more people, but it also created new logistical problems. The shelters and recovery programs were beginning to stretch their resources thin. The problem wasn't just homelessness anymore. It was the strain on the infrastructure meant to support people once they had housing. Trump's team quickly realized that they needed to implement more robust support systems, focusing not just on housing but on mental health services, addiction treatment, and long-term job training. Without these crucial elements, they risked repeating the cycle of failure that had plagued previous attempts to address homelessness. "You can't just put someone in a room and expect them to be fine," said Mark, one of Trump's key advisors, during an urgent meeting. "We need to provide more than just a roof over their heads. We need to help them rebuild their lives from the inside out." Trump listened closely. This was an insight he couldn't ignore. The mission had to be holistic. He couldn't just promise people housing. He had to promise them a pathway to stability. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but Trump was prepared to keep pushing. He knew the stakes were higher than just political success. The media played a critical role in shaping public perception of the homelessness initiative. With the program expanding, both positive and negative stories began to surface. While some outlets praised Trump's efforts, others were quick to point out the flaws. It was no surprise that the media's scrutiny was particularly intense when it came to cities like New York, where the homelessness crisis was deeply entrenched. Reporters flocked to shelters to capture the stories of people who had benefited from the initiative. Some shared their gratitude, like Victor, a man who had spent nearly a decade on the streets before receiving support through the program. "I never thought I'd be able to turn my life around, but I've been working at a restaurant for the past 3 months. I'm finally saving money," Victor said with a smile, his voice trembling with emotion. "This program gave me a second chance." But there were also critics who highlighted the setbacks. In some cities, shelters were overwhelmed and unable to keep up with the demand. There were reports of people falling through the cracks, slipping back into homelessness after being housed temporarily. These stories became headline news, fueling doubts about the effectiveness of Trump's approach. One of the most scathing reports came from a major news outlet in New York, which detailed a homeless man who had been placed in housing but was found on the streets again just weeks later, struggling with addiction. The report painted the program as a failure, stating that without addressing the root causes of homelessness, such as mental illness and substance abuse, the program was doomed to fail. Until we tackle the underlying issues, we're just putting a Band-Aid on a much bigger wound. The reporter concluded, a sentiment that echoed among the program's critics. Trump didn't back down. In fact, he welcomed the criticism. He knew that the process would never be perfect, and there were bound to be challenges. But he refused to let setbacks define the entire initiative. The media's scrutiny only pushed him harder to prove that the program could, and would, succeed in the long run. In the midst of these growing pains, Trump received some personal news that would add an emotional weight to his already heavy workload. His longtime friend and business partner, Steve, had passed away unexpectedly due to complications from a heart attack. The loss hit Trump hard, leaving him with a profound sense of grief. Steve had been a supporter of the homelessness initiative from the beginning, and his passing left a void that Trump felt deeply. As he took some time off to reflect on the loss, he realized that Steve's commitment to the cause had been driven by something beyond business interests. It was rooted in a shared belief that everyone deserved a fair chance, no matter their circumstances. He always said that you can measure a man by how he treats those who can't do anything for him, Trump said quietly to his team. This program, this mission, it's bigger than all of us. Steve's death was a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of the mission Trump had taken on. It reignited his determination to push forward, to honor Steve's memory, and to prove that the program could truly make a lasting impact on the lives of those who had been abandoned by society. As Trump prepared to address the nation, he knew that this moment was critical. He needed to outline a new phase of the homelessness initiative that would address the criticisms head-on and show that the program was evolving to meet the needs of those it aimed to help. In his speech, Trump acknowledged the difficulties the program had faced, but he also highlighted the successes: thousands of lives saved, families reunited, people employed again. But most importantly, he emphasized that the work was far from finished. "We are on the right path," Trump said, his voice resolute. "But we know there is more work to do. We will not stop until we've made homelessness a thing of the past. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But together, we can build a future where everyone has the chance to succeed." The speech marked a pivotal moment in the initiative. It wasn't the end, but a new beginning. Trump's words resonated with many who had been skeptical of his project. They could see that he was committed to seeing it through, no matter the obstacles. He had faced criticism, setbacks, and personal loss, but he had also seen the possibility for real change. After his speech, the atmosphere around Trump's homelessness initiative began to shift. For the first time, his message felt like it had a broader, national appeal. Communities across the United States, many of which had been wary of the initiative or skeptical of its long-term viability, started to rally behind it. The idea that homelessness wasn't just an individual issue but a community issue took root in many cities, large and small. The program's success in San Francisco had proven that it was possible to reduce homelessness, but Trump understood that it was never just about putting up a few shelters or creating a handful of job programs. The real challenge lay in sustaining the momentum, ensuring that all parts of the nation, from the bustling streets of New York to the quiet suburbs of the Midwest, could engage with the problem in meaningful ways. A few weeks after Trump's address, he traveled to Pittsburgh, a city often overshadowed by the larger, more talked-about crises in places like Los Angeles or New York. But Pittsburgh had quietly become one of the most successful examples of the homelessness initiative in action. Local business owners, residents, and city officials had all pitched in to help, and their efforts were paying off. In a meeting with the mayor, Trump was told that Pittsburgh had reduced homelessness by 40% over the past year, a statistic that no one could ignore. "You see, Mr. Trump, this isn't just a political issue. It's a human issue," Mayor Daniels said, beaming with pride. "Here in Pittsburgh, we're all part of the solution." The mayor was right. In Pittsburgh, people weren't waiting for a big, sweeping federal mandate to fix things. They were rolling up their sleeves and making it work themselves. Local businesses provided job training, churches and community centers offered support, and people who had once been homeless were now helping those in need. One of the most heartwarming stories came from Tasha, a woman who had spent years on the streets before enrolling in one of the program's recovery courses. She had now become a volunteer, mentoring others who were in the same position she had once been in. "If I can help even one person find their way out of this, it's all worth it," Tasha said, her voice steady with the kind of quiet strength that only those who have lived through hardship can possess. Trump's trip to Pittsburgh marked a turning point. He realized that the key to the initiative's success wasn't just about large-scale federal efforts. It was about creating a ripple effect. The more cities and local communities took ownership of the program, the more sustainable it would become. They were the ones on the ground, interacting with homeless individuals every day, and their involvement would ensure that the solution was not just temporary but a permanent part of the fabric of each community. In Chicago, a similar pattern emerged. Social workers, local nonprofits, and even high school students were getting involved in the cause. Chicago's vast network of shelters and social services began to collaborate in new ways, making it easier for people to access housing, healthcare, and job opportunities all in one place. The city had even started pilot programs in some schools to educate young people on homelessness and how they could contribute to the solution. "I didn't know anything about homelessness before this program," said Leah, a high school senior who had been volunteering at a local shelter. "But now, I see it differently. It's not just about giving someone a place to stay. It's about making sure they have the support they need to get their lives back on track." The momentum across the nation was palpable. Small towns, urban areas, and big cities alike were all finding ways to tailor the homelessness initiative to their specific needs. The more personal the solution, the more effective it became. However, as the national enthusiasm grew, so did the pressure on resources. The initiative had always been ambitious, but with so many local governments and organizations taking part, the demand on funding began to rise. Trump's team worked tirelessly to secure additional federal support, knowing that without sustained investment, even the most successful programs could falter. "Look, we've seen the success stories," said Mark, one of Trump's advisors. "But we can't rest on our laurels. If we're going to keep this going, we need to make sure we have the infrastructure to support it." The team worked closely with lawmakers to increase funding for the initiative, but there was still significant pushback from some conservative factions who questioned the costs and long-term benefits. They argued that the money could be better spent elsewhere, or that the program was simply too costly for the government to support indefinitely. Despite the opposition, Trump remained committed to making the program work. He continued to emphasize that homelessness was not just a temporary crisis but a national emergency that required long-term solutions. One of the most promising breakthroughs came from an unexpected source: the private sector. While many tech companies had been wary of becoming involved in social causes, a few forward-thinking leaders saw the opportunity to make a difference. Elon Musk, the CEO of a major tech company, stepped forward with an offer to partner with the initiative. "We've built companies that revolutionize industries. Now it's time to use that innovation to solve real-world problems," Musk said in a press conference announcing the partnership. "Homelessness isn't just a social issue, it's an opportunity for innovation, and we're here to help." Musk's company offered to provide affordable housing solutions, using innovative building techniques to create low-cost, sustainable housing units for people transitioning out of homelessness. The partnership provided a much-needed infusion of resources and technology, allowing for more scalable housing options at a time when the demand for shelter was only increasing. "Technology can solve a lot of the logistical problems we've been facing," Musk explained. "By cutting down on construction costs and speeding up the process, we can get more people into stable housing quicker." The collaboration between the private sector and the government became a model for other industries. Banks, retail companies, and even healthcare providers began to pitch in, offering job training, financial literacy programs, and medical care to those who had been homeless. The synergy between these different sectors helped turn the initiative into a more sustainable movement. As the program continued to evolve, it became clear that the issue of homelessness was no longer a political talking point. It had become a national priority. Whether it was through community partnerships, tech innovations, or government funding, people were taking responsibility in ways they hadn't before. Trump knew that the battle was far from over. There were still many hurdles to overcome, and the system was still fragile. But for the first time, he felt a real sense of hope. His vision had taken root, and the country was beginning to wake up to the reality that homelessness was not an inevitable part of society. It was something that could be solved. Despite the swelling wave of support for the homelessness initiative, things were far from smooth sailing. The increasing number of people involved in the project only made its challenges more complex. The pressure was on, and Trump knew that one misstep could undo all the progress made so far. The road to success had never been guaranteed, and it became evident that even with the best intentions and resources, there were still deep-rooted problems that couldn't be solved overnight. In many ways, the challenges were multiplying as the program expanded. It began in Los Angeles, a city already grappling with a notorious homelessness crisis. For years, the area had struggled to find a long-term solution, and now the initiative was at the forefront of trying to alleviate it. But the influx of new homeless individuals seeking shelter brought with it unforeseen complications. The shelters were overcrowded, and many residents voiced their concern about the strain on city resources. "I don't want to sound heartless, but this is too much," said one local business owner, speaking to reporters. "The whole neighborhood is being overrun, and it's not just the homeless problem anymore. It's about the effect this is having on our community." As protests grew in certain neighborhoods, the media quickly picked up on the growing unease in LA. Critics of the program used this to fuel their argument that the initiative was moving too fast, putting too much pressure on local communities without enough preparation or thought for the long-term impacts. Trump's plan to end homelessness sounds good on paper, but the reality is far more complicated. An editorial in one of the city's major newspapers read, "We can't just throw resources at the problem. There needs to be a comprehensive, multi-level strategy that goes beyond providing temporary housing." Trump watched as the criticism mounted. The backlash stung, but he wasn't surprised. This was always going to be a tough sell. The opposition was growing louder, but Trump refused to back down. He had weathered storms before in his career, and this would be no different. As the critics on the outside grew louder, cracks began to appear within Trump's own team. Not everyone agreed on the direction the initiative should take. Tensions flared among advisors, with some pushing for a more aggressive, top-down approach, while others advocated for a slower, more methodical rollout. Mark, who had been one of the most vocal proponents of the program from the start, became frustrated with the constant pushback. "If we keep hesitating and second-guessing ourselves, we'll never get anywhere," he said in a heated discussion with other advisors. "We need to move faster if we want to make real change." On the other hand, Elaine, the head of the team overseeing the program's implementation, worried that they were taking on too much too quickly. "We're talking about a nationwide program, and if we don't have the infrastructure in place to handle the scale of it, we're setting ourselves up for failure." The divide between the team members grew deeper, and Trump found himself having to mediate the conflict. He understood both sides of the argument. He had always been a man of bold moves, but he also knew that the key to lasting success was in careful planning. In the end, Trump chose to find a balance between the two perspectives. He called for a pause in some of the most ambitious parts of the plan, giving local governments more time to prepare. At the same time, he made it clear that the goal remained the same: to create real, lasting change. "I've been in the game long enough to know that you can't rush things, but you can't slow down either," Trump said at a press conference. "We'll take the time needed to get things right, but we're not stopping. Not now, not ever." One of the most stubborn problems the initiative faced was addiction. Despite providing shelter, food, and job training, many of the homeless individuals participating in the program continued to struggle with addiction. The statistics were sobering. Nearly half of those in the shelters had some form of substance abuse problem, and those numbers seemed to be growing. This posed a significant challenge. The program wasn't equipped to handle the complex nature of addiction, and many advocates began to ask the hard question: could the homelessness crisis truly be addressed if the issue of addiction wasn't dealt with first? Trump had to face this difficult truth head-on. He knew that while housing was a critical part of the solution, addiction needed to be addressed before any lasting change could be achieved. "I've been talking about housing and jobs, but it's time we talk about the harder stuff," Trump admitted during a meeting with his team. "If we don't have proper addiction treatment programs in place, we're not helping these people. We're just putting them in a new set of problems." With that realization, Trump called for an expansion of addiction services as part of the program. He committed to funding not just shelters, but comprehensive addiction treatment centers. These centers would provide rehabilitation, therapy, and support for those who needed it most. "We have to fix the root of the problem," he said in a follow-up statement. "It's not just about getting someone off the streets. It's about making sure they don't fall back into those streets because they couldn't get the help they needed." As the initiative continued to face setbacks, Trump began to reflect on the lessons he had learned so far. This wasn't just about winning over voters or gaining headlines. This was about real people, people who had been forgotten by society for far too long. The more he saw the faces of those in the shelters, the more he understood that this was a battle he couldn't afford to lose. The truth was, he couldn't fix homelessness overnight. But he had made progress, and that progress was undeniable. It would take time, resources, and a collective effort from all sectors of society. But the change had started, and Trump was determined to see it through, no matter how long it took. The setbacks hadn't broken him. They had made him more resolute than ever. He was willing to fight through the criticisms, the doubts, and the mistakes because the ultimate goal, helping those in need, was worth every challenge. As Trump's homelessness initiative continued to grow, it became clear that the path to success wouldn't be achieved alone. Despite the pushback, the setbacks, and the ever-present challenges, a surprising wave of support began to form from all corners of the country. Some of Trump's harshest critics were now stepping up to help, and some of his most unexpected allies were offering their assistance in ways no one could have predicted. It began with the rise of bipartisan support for the initiative. For years, homelessness had been a subject that both political sides had skirted around, unable to find common ground. But Trump's direct approach and willingness to engage with people outside the traditional political bubble started to change things. In cities across the country, Republican and Democratic mayors began to collaborate on projects designed to tackle homelessness. They put aside their ideological differences and focused on the one issue that was now universally urgent: providing solutions for the homeless. "Homelessness doesn't have a party affiliation," said Democratic Mayor Anna Jenkins of Portland during a joint press conference with her Republican counterpart from nearby Salem. "We may not agree on everything, but we can agree that something needs to be done about this." Trump's team knew this was a pivotal moment. He had always believed that working across the aisle could lead to meaningful change, and now that belief was coming to fruition. He welcomed the newfound bipartisan momentum with open arms, understanding that it could be the key to ensuring the initiative's survival long-term. While politicians worked together, a surprising ally emerged from the entertainment industry. Some of the most prominent figures in Hollywood, who had often been at odds with Trump on other issues, began to lend their voices and their wallets to the homelessness initiative. One of the most vocal supporters was actress and philanthropist Emma Roberts, who had long been involved in social justice causes. She knew the power of media to amplify issues, and she wasn't afraid to use her platform to bring attention to homelessness. "We need to stop treating homelessness as an afterthought," Roberts said in an emotional Instagram video that went viral. "These are human beings, not statistics." The initiative that Trump is leading may not be perfect, but it's making a difference. It's time we all step up and do our part. Other celebrities, including Chris Hemsworth and Selena Gomez, joined in, donating millions of dollars to support the initiative. They also participated in volunteer efforts, helping to build shelters and offering mentorship to people transitioning off the streets. Their involvement gave the program a significant boost, making it not just a political issue, but a cultural one. Public perception shifted once the faces of familiar stars joined the cause. Trump had never anticipated Hollywood's support, but as the months wore on, he saw how powerful it could be in turning public sentiment. With so much of the country watching celebrities like Roberts and Hemsworth speak out, the stigma around homelessness began to decrease. People started to view it less as a moral failure and more as a complex societal issue that required compassion, attention, and practical solutions. The private sector's involvement in the initiative was perhaps one of the most unexpected developments. Initially, many corporations had shown reluctance, thinking it was simply another social cause that would distract from their business goals. But as the initiative gained more momentum, businesses began to see it not just as a way to do good, but as a way to improve their image and align themselves with a growing national movement. One of the most notable partnerships was with Amazon, which committed to donating hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of supplies to shelters across the nation. But beyond that, Amazon took it a step further. The company introduced an innovative job training program designed specifically for homeless individuals, helping them gain the skills needed for employment within Amazon's sprawling network of warehouses and offices. Jeff Bezos, Amazon CEO, spoke about the decision in a public address. The solution to homelessness is not just about providing shelter, it's about creating opportunities for people to rebuild their lives. We're proud to be part of this effort. Other corporations, from small local businesses to giants like Microsoft, began following suit, offering job placement programs, mentoring, and even housing subsidies. The corporate community was no longer sitting on the sidelines. They were jumping in, ready to contribute to a problem that had been overlooked for far too long. While the national attention was important, it was the local, grassroots efforts that truly made the difference. Trump had always been a believer in the power of community, and he had seen firsthand how small changes at the local level could snowball into something much bigger. In New Orleans, a group of former homeless individuals, now stable and employed, started a nonprofit aimed at helping others who had been in their shoes. They mentored people who were still living on the streets, showing them the ropes of finding work, securing housing, and navigating the complexities of life after homelessness. "What we learned on the street stays with you," said Thomas, a former homeless man who now led the organization. "We've been there. We know how hard it is. And that's why we're here, to make sure others don't have to do it alone." Across the country, similar organizations were popping up, often led by people who had personally experienced homelessness. They provided support groups, job training, and a safe space where individuals could share their stories and find solidarity. This grassroots network was the lifeblood of the movement, and its impact was undeniable. With these new alliances forming, political, celebrity, corporate, and grassroots, the initiative was beginning to take shape in a way no one had imagined. The national conversation around homelessness had shifted from one of blame and skepticism to one of empathy, action, and collaboration. Trump continued to lead the charge, but he knew that it wasn't his voice alone that was driving the change. It was the voices of the countless people, leaders, advocates, survivors, who had come together and said, "Enough is enough." For Trump, this chapter marked a turning point in his initiative. The support was now there, in every form imaginable: financial, emotional, and political. But more than anything, it was the sense of collective responsibility that had ignited the country. As the momentum built and the initiative gained national attention, the day came when the program could no longer be seen as a mere proposal or a distant dream. Trump's homelessness initiative had evolved into something larger, a sweeping effort that was beginning to show real, tangible results. But even as success seemed imminent, the final test loomed ahead. Could it all come together in a way that would truly create lasting change? Months of hard work, collaboration, and determination had led to this moment. Local governments, corporations, celebrities, and everyday citizens had all come together to make a difference, but the initiative still faced one crucial challenge: sustainability. While the shelters, training programs, and addiction recovery centers were working, could they be maintained long-term? And could the public continue to support the project when the initial excitement faded? Trump knew that the answer lay in ensuring that the initiative didn't just survive, but flourished beyond the spotlight. That meant securing long-term funding, continuing to improve the program's efficiency, and most importantly, keeping the momentum going. "We've come a long way, but the real work is just beginning," Trump said during his final address of the program's first phase. "Homelessness is not something we solve overnight. It's a long-term effort, and we are committed to seeing it through." The initiative had already had a measurable impact. In several cities, the number of homeless individuals had dropped dramatically. Hundreds of people had been placed in stable housing, received job training, and secured employment. Families had been reunited, and lives had been changed. One of the most critical aspects of this initiative's success was its ability to transition from short-term solutions to long-term sustainability. Trump's team worked closely with local governments to ensure that funding for the project didn't dry up once the media attention waned. One of the major accomplishments was the establishment of a nationwide network of homelessness resource centers, strategically placed in cities across the country. These centers didn't just provide emergency shelter, They served as hubs for job training, addiction recovery, mental health services, and long-term housing solutions. They became an integral part of the fabric of local communities, working hand in hand with schools, businesses, and hospitals to ensure that the most vulnerable citizens were cared for. Additionally, the private sector remained heavily involved, with companies continuing to provide job placements and internships for people who had experienced homelessness. Many businesses offered tuition reimbursement programs, allowing individuals to continue their education and move up the economic ladder. These efforts worked in tandem with government programs, creating a powerful feedback loop of support. The key to this program's success is partnership, said Mark, Trump's senior advisor. Government, business, nonprofits, and local communities are all working together. This isn't just about policy, it's about people. For Trump, the success of the initiative wasn't just measured in numbers, it was measured in lives changed. He often found himself reflecting on the countless faces he had seen throughout the journey. The men and women who had once been invisible to society, but were now finding new paths forward. He remembered one of his earliest encounters with a woman named Maria, a single mother who had been homeless for years. When she was placed in a shelter and began receiving job training, Trump saw something in her that reminded him of his own family's struggles, how his own father had worked tirelessly to provide for him and his siblings, ensuring they had opportunities that he hadn't had. Maria had gone on to get a job as a cashier at a local store, and soon after, she was able to rent her first apartment. "I never thought I'd get to this point," she told Trump during a visit. "I thought I was going to be stuck forever. But this program gave me a chance. And now I'm giving my son a better life." Maria's story was just one of many. Trump was proud of what had been accomplished, but he knew that the real work lay ahead. This was a fight that would require continual effort, and he was ready for it. As the program entered its next phase, there was a growing sense of optimism in the air. Public opinion had shifted. What was once seen as a nuisance or a burden was now being viewed as an opportunity for the country to come together, not just to combat homelessness, but to demonstrate compassion on a national scale. Trump, who had once been a polarizing figure in American politics, found that his leadership had united people in a way few had expected. Democrats, Republicans, independents, and ordinary citizens all saw the progress that had been made and wanted to see it continue. The culture around homelessness had shifted. What was once a topic of divisive rhetoric was now a national mission. This was the power of a shared goal. This was the power of putting politics aside and focusing on humanity. Trump had taken on a challenge that no one else had dared to face, and with the help of countless others, he had brought the country one step closer to a solution. As the cameras faded and the speeches ended, Trump stood at the front of a modest building in New York City, a newly established resource center, watching as people filed in, their lives being changed by the programs he had fought so hard to build. The homeless problem hadn't been solved in full, but it was no longer something that was ignored. It was now a priority, and it had sparked a movement across the country. Local leaders, volunteers, and ordinary citizens were all now a part of something bigger than themselves. Trump's leadership in the homelessness initiative had left an indelible mark on the country. It wasn't just about changing lives, it was about changing the way people thought about the issue. Homelessness was no longer a statistic. It was a human issue, one that the entire country had worked together to address. As Trump turned to leave the building, his thoughts lingered on the road ahead. There were still obstacles to overcome, still progress to be made. But for the first time in a long while, he felt confident. They had started something incredible, and with continued support, this program would continue to thrive, changing lives, one step at a time. This was not just the end of a story. It was the beginning of a new era where every life mattered and every person had the chance to rebuild. The journey was far from over, but with hope, determination, and a united country, they would continue to move forward. Together,